Millionaire CEO on a trip receives an accidental hug from a girl and discovers true love. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. It all began on a rainy afternoon at the crowded international arrivals terminal. Sophie, a modest young woman wearing jeans faded by many washes and a simple jacket, stood near the baggage claim area, holding a little sign with her brother's name scrawled in neat letters. While everyone else seemed to be on their phones or craning their necks, Sophie was anxiously searching the throngs of travelers stepping off incoming flights. Her brother was returning from a long medical consultation in another city, and she was ready to whisk him away in a borrowed taxi to the small cafe where she worked, and where she desperately needed to get back on time for her evening shift. But fate had other plans that day. Amid all the commotion, people embracing, guides calling out for tourist groups, children running across the airport foyer, a sudden wave of passengers rushed through the automatic doors. Sophie turned, half sure she'd spotted her brother's familiar profile. Her heart leaped. She hastened in that direction and instinctively opened her arms, calling, "Julian!" Yet, before she could realize her mistake, she found herself wrapped around a stranger. For a perplexing moment, she felt a firm chest beneath her cheek. The man was tall, wearing what felt like a heavy coat, with the faint scent of an expensive cologne drifting off him. Realizing the blunder, she recoiled, mortified, cheeks aflame. I'm so sorry," she stammered, letting go in a rush. "I thought you were my brother." The man's expression mirrored surprise. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, likely Italian, judging by the subtle sheen of the material, and an elegant watch glimmered on his wrist. His eyes, a steely gray, momentarily widened before softening into an amused warmth. Around them, the bustle of the airport seemed to hush as though giving them a moment's stage, the world on pause to witness this unusual meeting. "It's all right," he replied, voice carrying an air of quiet authority. "No harm done?" His English was flawless, tinged with a mild accent that suggested an education abroad. Something about him exuded sophistication, yet he appeared intrigued, even charmed by the flustered Sophie. As quickly as it all happened, the moment shattered. An airport staffer ushered new arrivals forward. Lines formed. Announcements of flight delays echoed overhead. Sophie spun back around to locate her real brother, spotting him at last. He stood near the conveyor belt with a travel bag, raising his eyebrows in confusion at her embarrassing collision. Her cheeks still blazing, Sophie waved at her brother to follow her. "I'm so sorry again," she told the tall stranger, bowing her head in contrition. Then, turning on her heel, she guided Julian away. Not once did she look back, too mortified to see the man's reaction. But if she had, she might have noticed the intrigued sparkle in his eyes as he watched her slip into the crowd. Outside, the pouring rain felt colder than usual against her flushed skin. Julian teased her the whole way to the taxi queue. "Typical you, Sophie, always bumping into trouble," he said. "Didn't expect you to attack a random stranger with a hug." Sophie tried to find humor in her own embarrassment, but an odd sensation fluttered in her stomach, refusing to settle. Something about that man, the accidental warmth of that hug, lingered on her mind. She tried brushing it off. After all, she had bigger worries: her brother's health, the looming debts they shared, the cafe job that barely kept their heads above water. She had zero time to be daydreaming about some random traveler, no matter how refined and striking he might have been. By the time she and her brother finally arrived at the modest apartment they shared, she was already running late for her shift. Julian, with his frail frame and pale complexion, insisted he could handle the steps on his own. He had been having recurring issues ever since their parents' old family restaurant was forced into closure, a time that had also brought on Julian's chronic health problems. With no steady income and medical bills piling up, they'd found themselves moving from one cramped residence to another. "Sophie, hurry," he urged. "Your boss will be upset if you arrive late again. I'll heat up something simple for dinner. We can talk after your shift." Despite the mounting stress, Sophie leaned in to smooth her brother's hair affectionately, as though he were still the child she once tucked in at night. "All right," she said. "Don't forget your medication. I'll be back soon." She dashed out, ignoring the heaviness that always seized her when thinking of how precarious their lives had become. At the corner cafe, a cozy establishment known for its fresh pastries and aromatic coffee, Sophie busied herself wiping tables and checking orders. She forced a smile for every customer, determined to mask her exhaustion and the swirl of anxieties in her mind. The manager, a kindly older woman named Beatrice, greeted her with mild exasperation for being tardy but said nothing more. She knew of Sophie's circumstances and admired her resilience. As Sophie settled behind the counter, tying on her apron, her first order of the day was for a cappuccino. With the skill of someone who'd practiced for months, she produced a perfect swirl of foam on top. But just as she prepared to deliver it, she caught a glimpse of a man stepping in from the rain. Her heart stumbled. Standing at the threshold, hair slightly damp, the same impeccably tailored suit, was the stranger from the airport. He paused, scanning the interior. Despite the gentle clink of cups and hush of conversations, time seemed to slow as their eyes locked. A flicker of recognition crossed his features. He inclined his head politely. An electric tension bolted through Sophie. She nearly sloshed coffee over the rim but managed to correct herself. Why on earth was he here? They were nowhere near the airport, and her cafe was off the main thoroughfare. She quickly placed the coffee on a tray and walked to the table of an elderly couple, trying to calm her racing pulse. But she was aware of every step the stranger took, aware that he was stepping toward the counter where she'd just been. Beatrice, who saw everything, arched an eyebrow at Sophie. "Is he a friend of yours?" she murmured, intrigued by the man's polished presence. No. I think I saw him at the airport earlier," Sophie mumbled. The man politely waited until she had delivered the cappuccino. Then, hooking his gaze onto hers, he offered a disarming smile. "Good evening," he said, voice gentle but tinged with a certain confidence. "I wonder if you remember me." Sophie inhaled, cheeks glowing with renewed embarrassment. "Yes, about that. I'm so sorry about before. I thought you were someone else." He waved off the apology. "Don't worry. It's not every day a random hug brightens my day." There was a playful glint in his eyes. Actually, it was a pleasant surprise. Her pulse hammered. She realized that his presence commanded an air of quiet power, the sort one develops from traveling in circles of wealth and privilege. When he removed his coat, the well-fitted vest he wore beneath further suggested a man with resources. Expensive watch, well-trimmed hair, Sophie suddenly felt acutely aware of her own worn uniform and the drizzle-stained shoes she had never managed to replace. "Should I get you something from our menu?" she managed, stepping behind the counter. He nodded. "A black coffee, please, and if you have time, perhaps you could recommend one of your pastries?" Beatrice had busied herself in the back, giving them a moment of privacy. Sophie cleared her throat. "We make fresh croissants each morning. They're quite popular." He leaned casually against the counter. "I'll have one then." She began preparing his order in silence, acutely aware that he watched her every move. Despite the usual bustle of the cafe, customers calling for refills, machines whirring, the corner where he stood felt like its own private realm. When she set the coffee and a warm croissant on a plate, he accepted them with a thankful nod. "You know, I never introduced myself. I'm Josh." "Sophie," she replied simply, busying her hands by wiping the counter. "Nice to meet you, Sophie," he said. "I wanted to apologize for what happened at the airport. I must have looked a bit stunned. I'm not used to such enthusiastic welcomes." A flicker of humor danced in her eyes. "Really, you don't have to apologize. I'm usually not so clumsy. I was just worried about my brother." At the mention of her brother, he studied her more carefully, as though trying to glean more about her life from that one detail. but she offered no further explanation. Sophie could practically hear Beatrice's curious gaze from behind the storeroom door. Still, she forced herself to appear busy and professional, ensuring that other patrons didn't feel ignored. With her focus pinned on the coffee machine, she tried not to think too deeply about how unusual this all felt. But Josh was not the kind to be brushed aside. He sipped his coffee, nodded appreciatively, then asked quietly, "So, do you work here full-time?" "Mostly," she answered, placing clean cups on the shelf. "I've got bills to pay, responsibilities." She let the statement hang, uncertain why she was telling him these things. A stranger was not entitled to the details of her life. "I see," he said, his gaze gently lingering on her face. He hesitated briefly, as though on the verge of something personal. Then he simply said, "Your coffee is excellent. Very well made." Sophie gave him a small nod of thanks. She told herself this was just an ordinary encounter, just another customer from the many faces passing through the cafe daily. The fact that he was a wealthy, intriguing man who had come searching for her by coincidence, she dismissed it as a random stroke of luck. Yet luck, or destiny, weaves its threads in mysterious ways. Moments later, she heard the faint ring of her phone in the back of the cafe. It would be her brother, perhaps needing some reassurance or assistance. Before leaving to take the call, she glanced back at Josh, who quietly enjoyed his croissant without pressing her further. A pang of something, gratitude or maybe relief, traveled through her. But as soon as she grabbed the phone, Julian's voice, frantic and quivering, exploded from the other end. "Sophie, sorry to bother you. I hate doing this, but could you come home soon? My chest hurts a bit again." Her heart clenched. The worry for her brother overshadowed every other concern. "Of course," she said, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Try not to strain yourself. I'll see if I can leave early." But how was she supposed to ask Beatrice to let her go early yet again? She already risked losing this job if her tardiness or absences continued. Tension coiled in her stomach like a barbed wire. She hung up and hurried back into the cafe, only to find Josh still there, calmly finishing his coffee as though he had all the time in the world. One glance at her face, and his expression shifted to concern. "Is everything all right?" She opened her mouth, prepared to lie or dismiss his question, but the weight of her brother's health weighed heavily on her mind. I just have a family emergency," she said, voice trembling slightly. "My brother—" She paused, realizing she didn't even know why she was confiding in him. He was, after all, a complete stranger. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I need to see if I can leave early." Josh rose to his feet, took out his wallet and paid for his order, leaving a tip so generous it made her eyes widen. Then, with gentle insistence, he said, "Please take care of whatever you need. I hope your brother recovers soon." Just like that, he turned and made his way toward the exit. The room seemed dimmer in his absence. Sophie half expected him to say something else, to assure her that fate would cross their paths again. But life, she reminded herself, wasn't a fairy tale. The best she could hope for was that this man, the one she'd hugged by mistake, might someday pass by again, giving her a smile in quiet acknowledgement. As she took a deep breath and went to find Beatrice, her heart still hammered with the aftershock of that meeting. She tried to banish the thrill that kept creeping through her. She had responsibilities, and they had to come first. If she lost this job, how would they afford Julian's next round of treatments? But far away, outside the cafe, Josh lingered in the drizzle. He glanced back once at the lit windows, vaguely spotting Sophie's silhouette. An unusual warmth settled in his chest. Something about her, her honest eyes, her unassuming kindness, stirred an impulse in him to learn more. Turning up the collar of his coat against the misty rain, he made a silent decision. He would find a reason to return to that cafe, and if his instincts were correct, that unexpected hug at the airport was only the beginning of a story that would change both their lives. The rain had lightened to a gentle drizzle by the time Sophie stepped onto the narrow street leading to her apartment. She held a single umbrella that shook in the wind, mind spinning with concern for Julian. What if his pain had worsened? And with money so tight, how could they afford a better specialist? She inhaled deeply, trying to calm the wave of dread creeping over her. Day after day, it was a constant battle not just for survival but for her brother's very health. Upon opening the door, she found Julian lying on their small couch, one hand pressed to his chest, breathing shallowly. He tried to manage a smile at her worried expression. "Hey, Sophie," he said, subdued. "Sorry again for calling you at work. I know you can't keep leaving early." She shrugged off her damp jacket and hurried to his side. "Don't apologize. You're the only family I have, remember?" She touched his forehead, checking for fever, then noted how pale he seemed. "Is it the same pain as before?" He nodded, exhaling a trembling breath. "I think so. It always starts like a pressure, like someone pressing a heavy weight on my chest. The pills help a little, but they aren't strong enough anymore." Sophie's chest tightened with guilt and fear. Over the months, it had become clear that his condition was more serious than they'd initially realized. He had been postponing a necessary procedure because, as always, their finances stood in the way. "Try to rest," she murmured. "We'll get through this, one way or another." He took her hand. "You can't keep handling everything alone, Sophie. Maybe I can work, at least part-time." "Don't you dare," she cut in firmly. "Your job is to recover. Mine is to figure out how to pay for it." A feeble laugh escaped him. "I hate making you worry like this. Remember how we used to dream of traveling the world, seeing big cities, tasting new dishes, and now—" He motioned around at their cramped living room, a place they had never managed to decorate or repair. She gave him the most reassuring smile she could muster. "This is temporary. You'll see. Someday we'll have our own space again, and you'll be healthy enough to do all those things we used to talk about." Under that thin promise, Julian's eyes shone with a small flicker of hope. But as soon as he drifted to sleep, exhaustion overcame Sophie. She sank onto a creaking wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. The burden weighed heavily. An overdue rent bill, prescription refills, the next round of medical tests, and only the cafe job to keep them afloat. At that moment, recalling the accidental embrace with the stranger, Josh, made her feel foolish. Why was she thinking of someone with such a privileged air when she lived in a storm of financial and emotional chaos? She needed to focus on real problems, not dwell on whimsical what-ifs. Yet the image of him standing at the cafe counter lingered, a glimmer of gentleness in his eyes as he asked about her brother, the unexpectedly large tip he left. Sophie shook her head, pushing those thoughts aside. Morning brought no respite. Julian's breathing was more even, but she didn't dare leave him without cooking a simple breakfast. Some oatmeal, the last of their fruit, and a bit of tea. He insisted he was feeling slightly better, enough to convince her not to miss another shift at the cafe. "Go," he said, a determined edge to his voice. "I'll be fine." Before stepping out, she carefully counted the coins in her purse. Almost nothing left. Sighing, she vowed to check the cafe's notice board. Maybe someone was looking for a roommate, or perhaps there was a second job opening in the area. Anything to scrape together extra funds. The walk to the cafe was short, but filled her with dread. Beatrice was patient, but she might be reaching her limit with Sophie's frequent emergencies. True enough, the older woman greeted her with a pinched frown. "You left early again yesterday," Beatrice said, arms crossed. "I understand your situation, really I do, but I have a business to run. I can't keep letting you come and go at odd hours." Sophie hung her head. "I know, and I'm so sorry." Beatrice sighed, her stern features softening. "Don't apologize. It's just that when customers come, we're short-staffed. I can't afford to hire a replacement if you're not here." Before Sophie could respond, the cafe door chimed. Two regulars shuffled in, and Beatrice motioned her to get to work. Sophie put on her apron, resolved to do her utmost today, if only to keep the job a little longer. Hours blurred by with the hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle hum of background chatter. Sophie tried to maintain a cheerful facade, even though her heart thundered with worry about Julian. She barely had time to wonder if Josh would appear again. That seemed less likely than winning the lottery. Around midday, the rush subsided, leaving Sophie wiping tables with practiced efficiency. A sudden hush fell over the cafe's interior. She sensed a presence behind her, someone tall, wearing cologne reminiscent of polished wood and something sophisticated. She glanced up quickly. There he stood, Josh, looking every bit as refined as before. He removed a sleek jacket, scanning the cozy interior until he spotted her. Their eyes met in a silent greeting. Softer now, a smile curved his lips. Sophie realized she was staring and immediately ducked her head, returning to her task. She felt a strange warmth spread in her chest, a mix of embarrassment and a faint kind of relief. Meanwhile, he approached the counter, where Beatrice was sorting receipts. "Good afternoon," he said in an even tone. "Could I have a moment with your server, Sophie?" Beatrice eyed him, her protective instinct kicking in. After all, Sophie was like a daughter to her. "She's working," Beatrice replied, "and she's quite busy." A smile ghosted across Josh's features. "Then I'd like to order something, let's say 2 coffees, and maybe she can spare a minute to bring them to my table." Beatrice paused. Something about this man exuded wealth and sincerity in the same breath. She gave a small nod, turning to Sophie, who had hovered uncertainly. "Go ahead, take his order." Sophie cleared her throat. "Welcome back," she said softly, feeling the warmth deepen at his friendly expression. "Black coffee again?" "Yes, please," he answered. "And it's okay if I order one for you as well, right? Unless you have a strict policy." She raised her eyebrows, glancing at Beatrice. This wasn't typical, but the cafe was quiet at the moment. Beatrice signaled with a wave, half curious to see what might happen. "Go," she mouthed, quickly busying herself at the other end of the counter. Sophie prepared 2 coffees, heart pounding. She wasn't used to such attention, especially from someone like him. A million questions bubbled up in her mind, but she carried the cups to his table in silence. He stood until she sat across from him, as though mindful of etiquette. "Thank you," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "You really didn't have to order for me." He lifted his cup. "I'd rather not drink alone." His gaze flickered to her face, scanning her expression. "How's your brother? Did things improve?" The compassion in his voice hit her squarely. She took a sip to stall. We have some rough days. It's hard to manage his health care, with me just working here and all." Something unspoken passed through Josh's eyes. He nodded slowly, weighing the next words. "Forgive me if this is intrusive, but is it a serious condition?" Sophie's grip on her cup tightened. She usually despised sharing personal tragedies with strangers. Yet, something about Josh made her feel safe, or at least not judged. In hushed tones, she explained the basics: her parents' old restaurant going under, Julian's health complications, and the precarious finances forcing them to live day to day. When she finished, she realized the cafe felt oddly silent. Maybe because it was midday lull, or perhaps because her own voice had turned subdued and shaky. She found it surprising that she'd laid bare so much. "I'm sorry," she added quickly. "I didn't mean to go on about my troubles. You're just a customer." He lifted his hand gently, stopping her. "Don't apologize. You've been through a lot. But you don't seem the type to let hardship define you." The sincerity in his statement dissolved her usual guard. She exhaled, uncertain what to say next. Behind them, Beatrice was trying not to appear like she was eavesdropping, though her curiosity radiated. Finally, Josh cleared his throat, leaning forward. might have a proposition, actually. One that could help you and your brother." Her spine stiffened. She'd heard that line before, generally from people offering questionable deals or pity-laden charity. "Look, I'm not—" He spoke quickly, seeing her defensive posture. "It's nothing shady, I promise. I'm an executive in a holdings company. We have several businesses under our umbrella, including restaurants." He paused, measuring her reaction. "I came back to this city partly for personal reasons and partly to oversee the expansion of one of our hospitality ventures. I'll need good, reliable staff." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "You're offering me a job?" "A better paying one," he said calmly, "with benefits that might help cover your brother's medical insurance. I've seen the way you work here, your diligence, the care you put into each order, and I saw how responsible you are about your family. A genuine work ethic like yours is rare." She folded her arms, suspicious. Was this some kind of elaborate trick? "I don't know. Things like that don't just fall into my lap." "I understand your hesitation," he said. "I would be wary too. But it's not charity, Sophie. It's a real position, and you'd be doing me a favor by joining the team. Our new restaurant division desperately needs staff who can handle both the rush of customers and the everyday operations with honesty." She went silent, thoughts tangled. 1,000 cautionary flags popped up in her head. She barely knew this man. At the same time, a persistent sense of intuition tugged at her. If this offer was genuine, it could be the one chance to stabilize her life, maybe get Julian the treatment he needed. "How soon would you need me?" she asked, voice tentative. "If you agree," Josh replied, "we can arrange something swiftly. 2 or 3 weeks from now at most. I have a management structure ready, but I need to finalize staffing." Sophie swallowed. "Let me think it over?" "Of course." A silence stretched, full of unspoken possibilities. Then a customer wandered in, and Sophie leapt to her feet, remembering she was still on the clock. She mumbled an apology and hurried away to greet the newcomer, leaving Josh alone at the table. Beatrice, always watchful, approached him. In a low tone, she asked, "Is this really what it sounds like? A job offer?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I don't intend to mislead her. She'll have a real contract, fair pay, everything done above board." Beatrice studied him, as though trying to peel back every layer of politeness. At last, she sighed. She's had a hard life. If this helps her family, then good. She gave him a firm nod, then moved to the back. Josh sipped the last of his coffee, gathered his coat, and set down enough bills to cover the tab with another generous tip. As he stood to leave, Sophie intercepted him near the exit, face etched with conflicted gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for even considering me." He met her eyes, a gentleness there that made her heart skip. "You deserve better opportunities. My only request is that you be honest with me as well." She nodded, not fully trusting her voice. Then, in a heartbeat, he was out the door, stepping into the fading daylight. Through the window, she watched him walk away, overshadowed by the swirl of city bustle and passing cars. Behind her, the new customer signaled for a menu, reminding her to get back to work. Yet, her mind lingered, replaying every word. Could she trust his offer? And if she did, would she be stepping into a world so far from her own that it might end up complicating her life more? One thing was certain. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of genuine hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the lifeline she and Julian needed. She wondered what her parents, had they been alive, would advise her. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes you just have to believe in the kindness life offers, even if it shows up in the strangest ways." That night, as she cleaned the cafe counters and Beatrice turned the sign to closed, Sophie quietly resolved to take a leap of faith. Once the last patron filed out, she thanked Beatrice for her patience and hurried home. She needed to talk to Julian, to tell him what had happened. On the walk back, a gentle breeze carried the memory of that first accidental hug at the airport. And in that recollection, she sensed something new forming in her chest, a fragile but precious thread weaving her life's difficulties with a fledgling optimism. By the time she reached her front door, she'd made up her mind. She would accept Josh's offer. She just prayed she wouldn't regret it. Sophie braves the creaking stairs to her apartment with a flurry of excitement and nerves twisting in her stomach. She can hardly recall the last time she felt a genuine spark of hope like this. The battered metal key sticks momentarily in the lock, a reminder of how worn down everything in her life has become. Yet somehow, the minor frustration doesn't dampen her anticipation. She enters to find Julian in the kitchen area, hunched over an old recipe book he found buried in their mother's things. "Hey," he greets, glancing up. He sets the book aside and rubs at his sternum reflexively. Although his color looks a bit better than yesterday, the perpetual fatigue lingers around his eyes. "You're home late. Did something happen at the cafe?" Sophie eases off her shoes and drops her purse onto the only table in the cramped room. "It's been an interesting day," she says, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "How are you feeling?" "I'm okay," Julian answers with a half-smile. "Had some chest aches earlier, but I'm managing. Meds helped." He notices the spark in her eyes, mild as it is. "You look different, like you have news." She inhales, a slight tremble in her shoulders. "I do, actually." Glancing toward the window, she notices how the night's darkness seems oddly soft tonight. "Remember the man I told you about? The one at the airport?" Julian narrows his gaze playfully. "The stranger you tackled?" "I didn't tackle him," she protests, cheeks flushing. I gave him a hug by mistake." Despite her embarrassment, she can't help but let out a small laugh. "Well, he showed up at the cafe again." Julian's brow furrows. "Wait, you're serious? Twice?" She sinks into a chair across from him, wrestling with how best to explain. "His name is Josh. Apparently he's some big executive. He offered me a job, says he's hiring staff for a new restaurant project. It pays more than I could ever make at the cafe, and it comes with health insurance." A loaded silence stretches in the small kitchen, broken only by the faint hiss of the old refrigerator. Julian taps a finger against the table's surface, trying to process the news. "Wait," he says carefully. "He just offered you a job out of the blue? Did you apply somewhere else and not tell me? This is sudden." "It is," Sophie admits, "and I'm worried it might be too good to be true. But you should have heard him. He sounded genuine. And, well, we need the money. We need something more stable." Julian exhales, running a hand through his dark hair. "I hate that we're in this situation. You know I don't want you to feel forced into anything." She leans forward, taking his hand. "No one's forcing me. It's an opportunity I never expected, and it could cover your treatment, or at least help pay for better doctors." Her eyes shine with a fierce protectiveness. "I'm doing this for both of us." He hesitates, then nods, shoulders sagging. "All right. If it's what you want, I trust your judgment. But promise me you'll be careful, okay?" Sophie squeezes his hand in agreement. She stands to put the kettle on the stove, hoping to brew a bit of chamomile tea that might calm both of their nerves. "I'll be careful," she echoes, "but I'm determined to see if this leads somewhere." They speak little for the rest of the evening, lost in private thoughts. Julian dozes off in front of the TV, still clasping the recipe book. Sophie gently tucks a thin blanket over him, lingering for a moment to watch her younger brother sleep. She feels that familiar pang. Ever since their parents passed, it has always been the two of them against the world. Tonight, though, she doesn't feel quite so helpless. The next morning, Sophie phones Josh. Although her heart beats a frantic tattoo in her chest, she forces herself to speak steadily. He answers on the second ring. "Hello?" His voice is low, calm. Perhaps he's in a quiet setting. "Hi, it's Sophie. I've thought about your offer." There's a pause, as though he's stepping away from a conversation or some background noise. "And what did you decide?" She clutches the phone tighter, I'd like to accept if you still want me, but I'd need details and a contract. I won't resign from the cafe until we finalize everything." "Understood," he replies, his tone brightening. "I'm glad, truly. Let's meet tomorrow if you can, and go through all of it. I'll introduce you to some members of my team." They arrange a meeting time, and once she hangs up, Sophie realizes she's been holding her breath. She exhales heavily, leaning against the kitchen counter. Beside her, Julian pretends not to eavesdrop, unsuccessfully. "You said yes?" he ventures. She nods. He wants to meet tomorrow, sign paperwork, talk about duties. Her voice trails off. This might really be happening. It's remarkable how life can shift from dismal to hopeful in a mere span of days. That sense of possibility follows Sophie like a halo, even as she trudges through her shift at the cafe, smiling genuinely at the regulars. Beatrice eyes her with a mixture of relief and sadness. She can sense Sophie might soon be leaving. "Just make sure you do what's right for you," Beatrice says, patting Sophie's shoulder at the end of the day. "I'll be sorry to lose a good worker, but I'll be happier if you and your brother are taken care of." Sophie hugs her boss impulsively. The older woman stiffens in mild surprise, then relaxes with a gentle chuckle. "Thank you, Bea. You've been wonderful to me." The following afternoon, Sophie stands outside an impressive office building in the bustling financial district. The tinted glass exterior gleams under the midday sun, reflecting the world back in shimmering shapes. It's a jarring contrast to the sleepy, humble cafes she's used to. She almost turns around, nerves flaring. But then she thinks of Julian's face, the stress lines etched in his forehead. Resolving her courage, she pushes through the large revolving door. A receptionist in a sleek uniform greets her politely. "May I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Josh." She doesn't even know his last name, she realizes with embarrassment. The entire time she only heard him referred to as Josh. Yet the receptionist nods. "Yes, Mr. Alarcon is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 10th floor." Sophie's palms feel clammy against her purse strap as she steps into the mirrored elevator. "Alarcon," she thinks. "At least I know his last name now." The doors slide open on a corridor lined with modern art, every inch polished and pristine. She follows the signage to a corner suite, her footsteps sounding too loud in the hush. When she reaches the final door, frosted glass with the name Alarcon Holdings stenciled in gold letters, she hesitates. This environment is worlds away from her reality. Still, she knocks softly. Inside, she's greeted by a well-dressed assistant who leads her to a conference room. Floor-to-ceiling windows show the city skyline, making her a little dizzy. She tries not to stare, turning her attention instead to the round table in the center, where Josh sits with two other people, a man in a smart vest and a woman in a crisp blouse. Josh stands the instant she enters. "Sophie, welcome. Please sit." He motions to a chair. "This is Thomas, our general manager for the new restaurant, and Sabrina, our HR specialist." Polite handshakes follow. Sophie notices how both Thomas and Sabrina greet her with friendly professionalism, not the condescension she feared. Still, she's acutely aware of her own simple attire compared to their polished style. They open a folder, discussing the job description and responsibilities. She learns it's a position as an assistant supervisor within the front-of-house operations, helping manage servers, ensuring quality control, that sort of thing. The salary figure they name almost makes her gasp. It's far above what she ever earned at the cafe. Plus, the mention of health insurance for her and one dependent draws a wave of relief she can barely conceal. "Are you certain you want me in a supervisory role?" she asks, feeling both flattered and overwhelmed. "I've never managed anything on that scale." Thomas, the general manager, smiles. "We prefer someone who understands the everyday realities of waitstaff. You've worked in a cafe, you know how customers react, how employees feel. We can train you for the management aspects." Sabrina adds, "We've had issues before with managers who lacked empathy for their teams." Josh believes you'll do well because you've lived that position. Sophie turns to Josh, who's been listening in calm silence. He gives her a reassuring nod. They're right. You bring the perspective we need. Her chest tightens with a mixture of gratitude and a pang of disbelief. This is all so surreal. I don't know how to thank you. Just do your job well, Josh replies with a slight grin. That's all I ask. They go through formalities, signing forms, confirming she can start in 2 weeks, scheduling training sessions. The conversation is cordial, almost businesslike, yet Sophie detects the subtle glances Josh sends her way, a flicker of warmth and encouragement beneath his corporate exterior. Once everything wraps up, Thomas and Sabrina excuse themselves, mentioning another meeting. They depart, leaving Sophie and Josh alone by the wide window. Sunlight pours over them, and for a moment, she's speechless, reeling at how drastically her fortunes have changed. How do you feel? He asks quietly. Terrified, she confesses with a small laugh, but also excited. Thank you for believing in me. He watches her, something contemplative in his gaze. I've seen enough to know you'll handle any challenge, he says, turning to look out over the skyline. When I first returned to the city, I thought I'd just handle business matters and move on. I never expected to meet someone like you. His words stir a flutter inside her. She casts her eyes down, unsure how to respond. A compliment from a man who wields so much influence and wealth feels dangerously like stepping across a threshold she never dared approach. But before the moment deepens, a sharp knock at the door interrupts them. The assistant pokes her head in. Mr. Alarcon, you have another appointment in 5 minutes. Josh exhales. Right. He turns back to Sophie. Would you like me to have the driver take you home? She shakes her head quickly. Oh no, I'll be fine. Public bus is cheaper. He raises an eyebrow, about to protest, but she offers a tiny smile. Really, it's okay. I can navigate. Reluctantly, he accepts her decision. They walk together into the hallway where the swirl of offices and staff hastening about reminds Sophie that this is his domain. Fast-paced, refined, not at all like the modest world she's from. And yet, an inexplicable connection tugs at her each time his gaze brushes over her, each time his hand hovers as though he wants to guide her forward but holds back to respect her independence. Congratulations again, he says. I'll be in touch before your first training day. In the meantime, if you have any concerns, call me. She nods, stepping into the elevator. The doors slide shut, leaving him behind with an understated smile that sends an unexpected burst of warmth through her. Sophie grips the rail, eyes on the floor indicator ticking downward. Her life is about to change in ways she can't fully fathom. The pay alone will lift a crushing weight off her shoulders, not to mention the insurance that might finally get Julian the help he needs. Still, deep in her gut, she can't shake the sensation that there's a hidden piece of this puzzle, some twist of fate about to unravel. For now, she pushes the feeling aside. She has a contract, new possibilities, and for the first time in years, a sense that tomorrow might not be so grim. As she steps out of the high-rise and merges into the busy street, the sun hits her face. She allows herself the smallest smile. Change can be daunting, but it can also be the first step toward rebuilding a shattered life. Neither she nor Josh knows the full story yet. Neither can predict that, in the not-too-distant future, she'll discover the role Alarcon Holdings once played in closing her family's restaurant. Nor can they foresee how that revelation will send ripples of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak through both their worlds, testing whether genuine compassion can bridge the chasm that forms when past tragedies collide with present hopes. For now, all Sophie feels is the thrill of possibility, the bittersweet promise of stability, and a faint chord in her heart that resonates whenever she thinks of that unexpected airport hug, the very beginning of a new chapter in her life. Sophie's last 2 weeks at the cafe passed in a blur of farewells, bittersweet gratitude, and mounting anticipation. She insisted on finishing her notice period properly, not wanting to leave Beatrice in the lurch. Every morning she'd arrive and wrap herself in the familiar bustle of regulars and cappuccino foam. Every evening, she'd leave with a little pang in her chest, knowing it was nearly time to say goodbye to the place that had been her lifeline. Meanwhile, at home, Julian was already feeling the ripples of her impending new job. Knowing his sister would soon earn a steady wage with benefits seemed to lift the gloom that had weighed him down for months. He started flipping through their parents' old cookbooks again, reminiscing about the restaurant they once had, a dream snatched away when the lease was terminated years ago by some faceless corporate entity. That memory still pricked at them both, but at least now, there was hope for a better future. "You're sure it's okay for me to look up new specialists?" he asked one afternoon, perched on a rickety stool as Sophie folded laundry. "Absolutely," she said, determined. "We're going to have insurance soon, right? We'll figure it out." He closed the cookbook with a gentle sigh. "Maybe, if I get better, we can open a small place someday. I miss cooking. I miss the smell of fresh dough early in the morning." His eyes flickered with longing, and Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. She had practically grown up among simmering pots and swirling aromas, both of them helping their parents in the kitchen as kids. But that dream had crumbled when the restaurant was forced to shut down. She swallowed hard, pushing away her old bitterness toward the unknown company that had caused their eviction. "Someday," she whispered, folding the last shirt. "But for now, focus on resting." On the day of her official resignation, Sophie found the cafe more crowded than usual. Word had gotten around that she was leaving. A few loyal customers came to wish her well. Some even brought small tokens, a homemade pastry, a card. Beatrice tried to hold a stern expression, but tears brimmed in her eyes when Sophie handed over her neatly folded apron for the last time. "You come visit us, you hear?" Beatrice scolded gently, dabbing at her cheeks with a napkin. "Don't forget the little people when you're an important manager." Sophie shook her head. "Never. You all saved me when I needed it most." She said her final goodbyes and slipped out into the early evening. As she walked down the block, a black sedan pulled up, surprising her. The driver's window lowered, revealing Josh's familiar profile. "Perfect timing," he said, leaning over. "Need a ride?" She hesitated, glancing around. It felt strange to be picked up in such a sleek car. Yet the idea of traveling home with him, hearing more about the new job, filled her with gratitude. Eventually, she nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. The interior was all smooth leather, the faint hum of a refined engine. Josh started driving, navigating the city streets with casual familiarity. "So that's it? Your last day?" She sighed. "Yeah, it feels unreal. The cafe's been my entire world for so long." He shot her a quick, understanding glance. "I know change can be scary, but you're about to do great things, I'm sure of it." Sophie offered him a small smile. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken and electric. When the car pulled to a stop at a red light, she glanced at him, noticing how his shirt collar was slightly askew, the jacket draped over the back seat. He seemed both at ease and quietly focused on her every reaction. It sparked an odd flutter in her stomach, a blend of curiosity and an awareness that they came from such different worlds. "How's your brother?" he asked, shifting gears as the light turned green. Her smile faded. "He's stable. We're starting to look for specialists. I'm thankful we can even consider that now. Before, it felt like an impossible dream." Josh nodded, something like relief in his features. "If you need help, any hospital referrals or contacts, I might know a few people in the medical field. Let me know." She swallowed, touched by his offer. "Thank you. I might take you up on that." They drove the remaining blocks in a companionable silence. The city lights spilled through the windshield, reflecting off tinted windows in passing cars. Finally, he pulled up near Sophie's apartment complex, an old, unremarkable building with peeling paint. She braced herself for how it must look to him, but he showed no hint of judgment. "You're sure you don't want me to walk you up?" he asked, scanning the dimly lit street. She smiled softly. "I'll be all right. My brother's waiting inside. Thank you again." "Any time," Josh said. She slipped out, and for a moment they lingered, her hand resting on the car door, his gaze following her. Then she murmured goodnight, closed the door gently, and watched as he drove off, the purr of the engine fading into the distance. When she reached her apartment, Julian was seated at the little table, a grin on his face. "Now that's a fancy ride," he teased, eyeing her from across the room. "You looked like royalty stepping out of that car." Her cheeks warmed. "It's just a ride. He happened to be nearby." She set down her things and began recounting her final day at the cafe, editing out the flutter in her chest whenever Josh spoke. For Julian's sake, and maybe her own, she didn't want to overanalyze. She told herself that any warmth from Josh was merely kindness. Why would he, an executive with wealth and influence, have interest in someone like her beyond work? Still, as she drifted off to sleep that night, she couldn't help but linger on the memory of his voice and that fleeting sense of closeness in the car. Sophie's first week in training under Thomas's guidance was exhilarating and exhausting. The soon-to-open restaurant space echoed with the racket of final renovations, drills whirring, hammers pounding, the tang of fresh paint in the air. Despite the chaos, Thomas led her through the daily responsibilities, managing staff rosters, checking equipment, ensuring compliance with health regulations, and liaising with the chef about menus. "It's not glamorous work," he warned her, stepping over a bucket of paint, "at least not until opening day. But if we do this right, we'll have a smooth launch." She nodded, taking notes with single-minded focus. She was determined not to let Josh or anyone regret bringing her on board. The staff around her, new hires, bartenders in training, interns, tended to gravitate to her, possibly because she came across as approachable. Some confided small complaints or suggestions about the workspace. Sophie tried to mediate, remembering how, at the cafe, frustration could build if managers didn't address problems quickly. By the end of each day, her back ached and her clothes smelled of paint, but she felt strangely fulfilled. It was far from perfect. She was learning at a breakneck pace, sure she'd make a million mistakes. Yet each small success, whether it was solving a scheduling conflict or clarifying a menu misunderstanding, filled her with pride. Occasionally, Josh would drop by the site, checking on progress with Thomas. Each time, Sophie's stomach tightened. She noticed how the construction workers and staff snapped to attention, as though aware that his approval might dictate the entire project's success. But Josh himself was calm, quietly asking about budgets, deadlines, or staff concerns. Then he'd glance at Sophie, offering a subtle smile of encouragement. She'd usually nod back, heart hammering for no good reason. Midweek, just after the lunch break, Sophie sat on a wooden crate near the soon-to-be dining area, sorting staff files. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Seeing it was Julian, she quickly answered, concern flickering. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked. She heard rustling, then her brother's excited voice. "I got an appointment with a specialist at the new cardiac center downtown, next Tuesday." Relief and joy coursed through her. "That's amazing. They took our insurance application already?" He chuckled softly. "I guess so. I tried my luck explaining we were in the process of finalizing coverage through your new job. And they went for it. They slotted me in earlier than I expected." Sophie exhaled a shaky breath, tears threatening to well in her eyes. "Oh, Julian, it's wonderful. I can't believe it." They spoke a few more minutes, the conversation bright with hope. By the time she hung up, Sophie felt lighter. She set aside the files, pressing her hands over her face as relief blossomed in her chest. Maybe all their struggle was paying off. They were finally moving in the right direction. That evening, she stayed late at the site, helping Thomas finalize a floor plan for the table layout. Most of the workers had gone, leaving the place oddly quiet. The neon glow of streetlights shone through the windows, bouncing off half-assembled tables. They were so absorbed in their discussion, arguing about spacing between tables, that neither noticed someone else had entered until he cleared his throat. Josh stood by the door, jacket slung over his arm, an amused expression on his face. "Burning the midnight oil, I see," he remarked. "Working this hard might put me out of a job." Thomas grinned. "We want this launch to be perfect. You know how the press loves to jump on any chaos." Josh crossed the distance, glancing at the half-drawn plans. "How about I order in some dinner for you two? You shouldn't skip meals." Thomas politely declined, gathering his things. "Thanks, but I need to get home to my wife. I'll see you both tomorrow." With that, he left, leaving Sophie and Josh alone in the expansive, dimly lit restaurant. Josh turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. "Are you also heading out, or do you want dinner? My treat." Sophie hesitated. Her mind flashed to Julian at home. Would he be upset if she was late? Yet her phone had not rung again. If he was stable and resting, maybe a quick meal wouldn't hurt. "I suppose I could eat," she said at last, mustering a smile. "I skipped lunch to finish these staff schedules." He nodded, pulling out his phone to place an order, some Thai takeout from a nearby spot. Within half an hour, they were perched at one of the newly installed booths, a small lamp casting warm light over cardboard containers of noodles and curry. The building felt almost ethereal in its half-completed state, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "Your first week?" Josh said, leaning back. "How are you finding it?" She set down her chopsticks. "It's challenging, but I like it. I like solving problems, helping the staff. It reminds me a bit of the cafe, except on a bigger scale." He watched her intently. "I'm glad. It's exactly why we wanted you here. You understand what the team goes through." Nodding, Sophie tried to hide the shy pleasure she felt. After a moment, she ventured, "Is this your usual approach, offering people from small cafes high-ranking jobs?" He gave a short laugh. "No. This is new for me, too. I typically rely on HR to handle hires, but something about you told me we needed your perspective." She studied him across the table. Under the soft light, his features seemed gentler, the usual business-like facade tempered by a trace of vulnerability. "Well," she murmured, "thank you for taking a chance." Their gazes locked. Her heart did that quick flutter again, a subtle warmth filling her chest. She glanced away first, unsure how to navigate these waters. Co-workers, she reminded herself. At least that's how it had to remain. Josh broke the tension by checking his watch. "It's getting late. Let me drop you off. It's not safe for you to be walking or taking a bus by yourself at this hour." She wanted to argue, but her leftover pride felt less important than the idea of getting home quickly, especially when Julian might be waiting. "All right," she said, packing up the empty containers. They walked out together, flipping off the lights and locking the door behind them. Outside, the city's night air was cool, a faint breeze ruffling Sophie's hair. She realized she hadn't noticed it was so dark, so quiet beyond the distant hum of cars. Josh opened the passenger door for her, waiting as she settled in. Once he climbed in on the driver's side, he adjusted the mirror and navigated the empty roads with a comfortable silence. The hush between them wasn't awkward now. It felt calm, a gentle camaraderie forged by these late working hours and the shared meal. When he finally pulled up to her apartment, he turned the engine off. For a moment, they both just sat there, watching the glow of the streetlight against the curb. "Thank you again," she said softly. "For dinner, for everything." He nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "No need to thank me. You're part of the team now." With that, she opened the car door, stepping onto the worn sidewalk. Despite the chipped paint and rickety front stoop, somehow her surroundings felt less grim than usual. She looked back at him, the overhead lamp gilding his face in subtle gold, and for a fleeting second, something akin to affection coursed through her. But she tucked it away. She had responsibilities, a family crisis to manage, and no room for confusion. "Good night," she said, stepping back. "Good night, Sophie," he replied quietly. Then he switched on his headlights, driving off into the city's tapestry of neon signs and tall shadows. Upstairs, Julian dozed on the couch, that same old cookbook on his lap. Sophie set her bag aside and gently touched his shoulder. He stirred, blinking. "You're home. Did you eat?" She nodded, sinking onto the cushion beside him. "Yes, we had some late dinner at the site." He smiled groggily. "See? Your new job is already feeding you." He teased, but beneath his words was relief that she seemed well. Sophie glanced at the clock. Almost midnight. Another day gone, and tomorrow would bring fresh demands. Yet, for the first time, she felt an undercurrent of peace. Her brother's health was beginning to get attention. She had stable work, and, if she was being honest, the quiet moments in Josh's presence left a trace of warmth she couldn't ignore. Standing, she went to brew a quick herbal tea, though she suspected it'd do little to calm the swirl of thoughts in her head. She could only pray that this new beginning wouldn't be shattered by unforeseen shadows lurking in the past. Because some corners of her old life had yet to be explored, chief among them, the painful memory of the restaurant's closure. Perhaps it was best not to dwell on that. She had no reason to connect it to Alarcon Holdings. How could she possibly guess that her family's restaurant had once been in the path of a subsidiary company? For now, she told herself, let the future remain bright and uncomplicated, even if it was just for a little while longer. Sophie woke up early on Saturday, sunlight sneaking through the thin curtains of her bedroom. Outside, the city seemed almost peaceful for once. Less traffic, fewer horns blaring. She rubbed sleep from her eyes and remembered the day's plan. She was finally taking Julian to see the specialist. An undercurrent of nervous excitement buzzed in her chest. Though it was the weekend, Thomas had assured her she could skip any on-site responsibilities. The restaurant's grand opening was still a couple of weeks away, so final touches continued, but her presence wouldn't be critical for a day or two. Sophie felt grateful for the flexibility. One more sign of how this job truly was a lifeline. In the living room, she found Julian pacing slowly, wearing his best shirt and fidgeting with the sleeves. "You ready?" she asked gently. "Yeah," he said, forcing a hopeful grin. "As ready as I can be. It's not every day I see a fancy specialist." Sophie's gaze flicked to the clock. "We've got time. Let's head out early in case there's traffic." They descended the rickety staircase of their old apartment building and stepped onto the street. Sophie had splurged on a taxi, not wanting Julian to exhaust himself. As they drove to the medical center, he gazed out the window, lost in thought. "You know," he said after a while, "I've been thinking about our parents a lot recently, wondering if they'd be proud of us." "They would be," Sophie insisted firmly, taking his hand. "You fought so hard, never given up. And I'm trying to build a better life. I like to think they're cheering us on." He nodded, biting his lip. They both knew that lurking beneath the surface were painful memories of their parents' restaurant shutting down, a wound neither had fully healed. Their mother and father had poured their souls into that place, only to lose it overnight to a business expansion that no one had explained clearly. Julian had always felt something more sinister was at play, but they'd never learned the details. At the medical center, a gleaming building of glass and steel, a polite receptionist handed them forms. Sophie saw her brother's shoulders tense. These places always came with a swirl of anxiety, but the staff recognized his referral, ushering them toward a waiting lounge filled with hushed conversations and the distant smell of antiseptic. Soon enough, a specialist appeared. Middle-aged, with kind eyes, he introduced himself as Dr. Morales and led them into an examination room. After checking Julian's vitals and reviewing preliminary notes, he began to discuss potential tests and procedures. "We'll start with a stress test and some imaging," Dr. Morales said. Given your symptoms, we want to pinpoint the exact cause of these chest pains. Could be congenital, could be something else, but we have options, especially now that your insurance is coming through." Julian looked at Sophie, relief and fear mixed in his gaze. He squeezed her hand when the doctor mentioned a specialized procedure that might help correct a defect in his heart's valve. It was expensive, complicated, but might be the long-term solution they'd prayed for. Afterward, they emerged into the corridor, instructions for next steps in hand. Sophie felt the world tilt slightly, overwhelmed by medical jargon, but also strangely buoyed by hope. They had a plan. For once, it wasn't just patching symptoms with Band-Aid fixes. As they walked toward the main exit, a voice called out, "Sophie, is that you?" She turned, startled, to see an older woman approaching, someone who looked vaguely familiar, though Sophie couldn't place from where. The woman wore a stylish blouse, a designer purse over her shoulder, and an expression of polite curiosity. By her side stood a younger woman with sleek hair, staring at Sophie with a kind of aloof scrutiny. Sophie blinked, searching her memory. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The woman's lips curved in a smile. "Perhaps not personally, but I believe we crossed paths a few years ago, around the time your family's restaurant closed." She paused, letting the statement settle. "I'm Carmen Alarcon, Josh's mother." At that, Sophie's stomach lurched. She hadn't realized Josh's family even lived in this city, or perhaps they had business connections here. After all, Alarcon Holdings was more expansive than she could have imagined. Carmen studied Julian, then returned her attention to Sophie. "Josh mentioned he hired a promising new manager from a cafe. I didn't connect it to you until now. I recognized your surname on some documents regarding that old property, the old restaurant your parents once ran." Sophie felt her skin grow cold. Julian, at her side, stiffened as well, instantly on guard. "Documents?" he murmured. But Carmen's expression remained mild, almost dismissive. "Yes, well, the business world can be complicated. I'm sure it was nothing personal. That property was part of a large acquisition. My son rarely involves himself in all the smaller details. Anyway," she waved her hand, "I'd heard you were working with Josh. Quite the coincidence." Sophie's mind spun. Was she implying that Alarcon Holdings had a direct hand in shutting down her parents' restaurant? She glanced at Julian, who looked as though a dormant anger threatened to surface. For years they'd wondered who was responsible for displacing them. Had it truly been the Alarcon family? Meanwhile, the younger woman by Carmen's side cleared her throat, impatient. Carmen seemed to remember her manners. "Oh, yes. This is Valeria. She's been close to our family for many years." The hint of a proud smile touched Carmen's lips. In fact, she and Josh once planned to— "Mrs. Alarcon," Valeria interrupted, tone cool and precise. She cast a polite nod toward Sophie and Julian, but didn't seem particularly interested in small talk. "We should go. Your appointment is soon." A flicker of tension passed between them. Carmen nodded. "Yes, of course. It was lovely seeing you, Sophie." Her gaze flicked toward Julian. "And you too, dear. Best of luck with everything." They swept away, leaving Sophie and Julian in a quiet bubble of shock. Julian was the first to speak, voice tight. "Did I hear that right? She's Josh's mother, and possibly the same person behind the closure of our family's restaurant?" Sophie swallowed. "She mentioned something about a property acquisition. I didn't realize it was connected to them, or to him." "That means the entire time you've been working for Alarcon Holdings, you've been working for the same company that forced us out of business," Julian said, voice trembling with the effort to keep it low. "Sophie, this can't be coincidence. They destroyed our parents' dream." She grabbed his arm, trying to calm him before his health deteriorated. "We don't know everything yet. Let's not jump to conclusions. Josh might not even have known. She said it was part of a larger deal. Julian's eyes flashed. He's at the head of this empire, isn't he? Or near enough. How could he not know? Sophie felt her throat tighten. She'd left the medical center brimming with hope, only to stumble into a revelation that threatened to unravel the fragile trust she had in her new boss. "Let's go home," she said softly. "We'll talk about it there." The taxi ride back was tense. Julian stared out the window, silent and brooding. Sophie could almost feel his heart pounding with resentment. She tried to remain calm, rationalizing that maybe Josh truly had nothing to do with the restaurant's closure. Surely he would have mentioned it, right? But doubt gnawed at her. She recalled the fleeting looks on Carmen's face, the hint of condescension, the undertone of nothing personal in reference to her parents losing everything. Even though she didn't want to blame Josh, her mind churned with confusion. If the Alarcon family had indeed orchestrated that acquisition, then they bore responsibility for so many of her family's hardships, including, indirectly, Julian's declining health, brought on by the stress that followed. When they arrived at the apartment, Julian marched inside without waiting. Sophie scrambled to pay the driver, then rushed after him, worry etched across her brow. She found him pacing in the living room, fists clenched. "I'm sorry," she began, not even sure what she was apologizing for. He stopped, exhaling. "It's not your fault. You didn't know. But I can't believe this is happening. Of all the people in this city, you ended up working for them." She sank into a chair, feeling a burn behind her eyes. "I left the cafe because I thought this was my one chance to help us. I didn't know that my new job might be linked to the same corporation that destroyed our parents' livelihood." Julian ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm himself. "Maybe you should confront Josh. Just ask him outright if he knew, if he's responsible." Her stomach twisted at the thought. "And what if he is?" she whispered. "What if he's known from the start?" "Then you quit," Julian stated, eyes blazing. "We can't accept money from them no matter how badly we need it. Our parents' dream was trampled by these people. How could we let them keep trampling us now?" Tears threatened to spill, but she forced them down. "Yes, but your health. We just saw the specialist. We're so close to affording real care. Without this insurance, how do we pay for your procedure?" Julian's anger dimmed, replaced by guilt. "I don't know," he admitted, voice cracking. "I only know what they did to Mom and Dad. They died struggling in debt, in heartbreak." She stared at the worn carpet. The memory of her parents weighed heavily, a father with a failing heart, a mother who'd lost her spark. They passed away not long after losing the restaurant. She and Julian had been so young, forced to fend for themselves with meager side jobs. Her phone suddenly buzzed, snapping the tension. She glanced at the screen. A message from Josh, asking how Julian's appointment had gone. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, longing to confide in him about the progress, rage at the possibility he might be complicit in their tragedy, confusion because she could not reconcile his kindness with the notion of him being the villain who stole their home. She set the phone aside. "I can't deal with this right now." Julian nodded stiffly, rubbing his chest. "Let's just try to breathe. We'll figure it out." That night, Sophie tossed and turned, plagued by restless dreams. In one, she saw her parents standing outside their old restaurant, the lights turning off as a lock was placed on the door. Then Josh appeared wearing an expensive suit, stepping over the threshold as if he owned the place. She jolted awake, heart racing. Morning light filtered through the dusty curtains. She sat up, hugging her knees. Everything about her new life, the blossoming sense of security, the budding admiration for Josh, now felt tainted by suspicion. Should she confront him? Or wait until the next time they met on site and see if he offered any explanation himself? Deep down, she knew waiting was futile. If there was a dark secret in his family's dealings, he likely wouldn't volunteer it, especially if he assumed she was unaware. Yet thinking of him as a cold-hearted businessman felt wrong. Every interaction so far showed him to be caring, considerate, even gentle with her. Still, It wouldn't erase what might have been done to her family. Her heart clenched, a swirl of grief and anger rising in her chest. Julian was right about one thing. They had to know the truth. She slid off the bed and splashed water on her face in the bathroom's cracked sink. "You have to be strong," she told her reflection. "For Julian, for Mom and Dad." It was time to uncover exactly what role Alarcon Holdings played in that property deal. One way or another, she had to learn if this man she was starting to trust, perhaps even care for, was actually behind her family's greatest heartbreak. If he was, she would never forgive him. And if he wasn't, then perhaps they still had a future, whatever that might look like. But the path to answers would not be simple, and the risk of heartbreak loomed large. Sophie closed her eyes, steeling herself. She had to face Josh, ask him directly, and let the truth fall where it may. Sophie spent Sunday morning battling with herself. On one hand, she replayed every encouraging thing Josh had done, the job offer that saved her and Julian from drowning in bills, the quiet gestures of kindness that showed he wasn't just some ruthless CEO. On the other hand, she couldn't erase the image of her parents standing outside their shuttered restaurant, the devastation etched on their faces. By midday, she decided there was no more room for speculation. She needed facts. If the Alarcon family were truly responsible for the closure, proof must exist. Records of property takeovers, old contracts, or legal documents. Perhaps the local municipal office stored them, or maybe old news articles covered the event. Instead of moping in fear, she'd investigate. After lunch, she donned a light jacket and told Julian she had an errand. Her brother, though still tense, gave her a nod of encouragement. He was too tired to join her, but promised he'd be waiting, eager for any answers she found. Sophie's first stop was the library downtown, a dignified old structure with stone pillars. She remembered it had archives of newspapers and public records. Inside, she explained to the librarian that she was looking for information on past property acquisitions in the city. The librarian, an older man with glasses perched at the tip of his nose, kindly pointed her to the local history section, plus a set of dusty file cabinets containing newspapers on microfilm. For over an hour, she hunched over a microfilm reader, scanning headlines from years past. Her eyes strained as she searched for any mention of her parents' restaurant. She almost gave up when a short piece from 7 years ago caught her eye. Family-owned establishment closes amid alleged corporate expansion. Her heart lurched as she read details of a small family restaurant losing its lease due to a development project overseen by a holding company. No direct mention of Alarcon, but a reference to a shell subsidiary. The wording was vague, just enough to suggest the restaurant's forced closure was part of a bigger real estate deal. Sophie scrolled to the next column and found a brief mention of outraged locals who believed the closure was unjust. But apparently, after a small protest, everything fizzled out. She recognized in the article's quotes the heartbreak her mother had expressed. A knot formed in Sophie's chest. This was it, her family's story, reduced to a footnote in a business transaction. She jotted down the name of the shell company, GC Enterprises. She suspected it might be an arm of Alarcon Holdings. The way Carmen had spoken at the hospital, casual, dismissive, made Sophie suspect many deals were hidden behind front companies to avoid direct blowback. Leaving the library, she headed to the municipal records office. The clerk on duty looked bored behind a tall counter, but brightened when Sophie politely asked about archived property transactions. After paying a small fee, she waited as the clerk disappeared into a back room, rummaging for files. Eventually, he returned with a battered folder, labeled with the property's address. She found the official notice. The building was acquired by GC Enterprises exactly 1 month before the restaurant's forced closure. The new owners tripled the rent and restructured the space, effectively pushing her parents out. Then, less than a year later, GC Enterprises transferred the deed to a larger conglomerate, Alarcon Holdings, listed in small print at the bottom of the page. A wave of nausea rolled through her. So it was real. Her family's downfall was indeed orchestrated in part by the labyrinth of acquisitions leading to Alarcon Holdings. Maybe Josh hadn't personally signed the documents, but his family's empire certainly had. Heart pounding, she stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The reality was undeniable. Her family had been a casualty of the Alarcon machine, and now she was working for that same corporate power, receiving a salary that might just be tainted by the memory of her parents' ruined dream. She closed her eyes, pressing the folder against her chest. Should she confront Josh with these papers? Or was there a chance he'd never even seen them? She pictured his warm expression, the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe he was different from the cold transaction that had cost her everything. But she couldn't ignore that his mother, Carmen, had recognized her name and basically confessed to the property deal with an offhand remark. She recalled Carmen's companion Valeria, someone apparently important to Josh once. The subtle tension between them pricked at Sophie's mind. Eventually, she decided the confrontation would happen face to face. She couldn't let this fester. If there was any chance Josh was innocent, she needed to give him the opportunity to explain. If he wasn't, if he'd known all along, she would quit, no matter how dire her brother's situation. Clutching the folder, she hailed a taxi back to the apartment. Julian was still resting when she arrived, so she quietly placed the documents in a drawer. She'd talk to Josh the following day at the restaurant site. For now, she'd keep the peace at home. Her brother didn't need more stress. Morning came too soon. Sophie dressed in her new uniform, professional yet comfortable, and slipped the folder into her bag. She headed to the half-completed restaurant, heart hammering. The city's rush-hour noise felt distant, as though her entire focus was pinned on what lay ahead. Thomas greeted her at the door, arms full of paint samples. "Hey, we've got to finalize the color for the private dining area. Glad you're here." She forced a smile, nodding. "Sure thing." But as they discussed, her eyes kept drifting to the entrance, waiting for Josh. Hours trickled by. She triple-checked staff schedules, but he didn't appear. By mid-afternoon, she felt tension gather behind her eyes. He rarely missed an entire day of on-site progress. Finally, around 4 p.m., she summoned the courage to ask Thomas if Josh was expected. Thomas scratched his head. "He's at a meeting across town. Might swing by later or might not." "Why, do you need him for something urgent?" Sophie fought the urge to show him the folder. She liked Thomas. He was fair and reliable, but this confrontation was too personal. "Nothing that can't wait," she managed, her tone subdued. By 7 p.m., the team was winding down. A quick check with Thomas revealed Josh probably wouldn't arrive. She hovered near the staff locker area, anxiety coiled in her stomach. Then, her phone buzzed. A text from Josh. "Sorry I couldn't make it today. Are you still at the site? If you need a ride or help with anything, let me know." Sophie stared at the screen, a storm of emotions swirling. She typed back, "I'm about to leave. Could we meet tomorrow morning? There's something important I'd like to discuss." His reply came swiftly. "Of course. Meet me at the office." 9 a.m.? She agreed, heart pounding. At least this would be private. No curious staff or construction workers around. She spent a restless night once again, half of her consumed by dread, half by a tiny spark of hope that there could be an explanation, an apology, something that might soothe the betrayal she felt. Next morning, she arrived at Alarcon Holdings' main office building at exactly 8:55, the folder cradled under her arm. The receptionist recognized her, greeting her warmly, and said Josh had just stepped in. Sophie rode the elevator to the top floor, feeling each shift in altitude as a lurch in her stomach. Stepping into the executive suite, she passed a few staff desks, all empty except for one assistant who ushered her to Josh's office. The door was slightly ajar. She heard him on the phone, his tone authoritative. Then he noticed her presence and ended the call. "Sophie," he greeted, standing up. He seemed genuinely pleased to see her, a small smile forming on his lips. "Good morning. Come in." She closed the door behind her and saw him gesture to a seat near his desk, an imposing mahogany piece that gleamed under the overhead lights. A window stretched behind him, offering a panoramic view of the city. For an instant, she thought how ironically it mirrored the power he and his family wielded, towering over everything. He sensed her hesitation. "Is everything okay?" She set the folder in her lap, swallowing. "I'm not sure," she said, voice trembling despite her resolve. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Josh's brow creased in concern. "Of course, you can ask me anything." She pressed her hands over the folder. "This job, the money, the insurance, it's been a godsend for Julian and me. But I've discovered something about how my parents' restaurant was closed years ago. It was forced out, and from what I've learned, it was part of a property acquisition by a shell company that eventually transferred ownership to Alarcon Holdings." His expression shifted, surprise, then confusion, then something that looked like alarm. I don't recall that specific acquisition. We have so many holdings. Wait, are you sure?" She opened the folder, pulling out the documents. "I have the records right here. The property changed hands multiple times, but the final owner was your family's company." Her voice caught. "That's why my parents lost everything." Josh's gaze flicked to the documents. He stood slowly, rounding the desk to examine them. His face tightened. "This is from 7 years ago. I was finishing grad school abroad at the time. My father was still alive and my mother was handling the real estate expansions. I had no idea." Sophie tried to read his eyes. "So, you didn't know you contributed to my family's ruin?" He looked pained. "Sophie, I swear I never saw these. We have thousands of properties. This was probably a small asset in a larger development. My father's approach to real estate was aggressive. He rarely cared about the personal toll. He only looked at the bottom line. And my mother, well, she often followed his lead." A wave of relief warred with raw anger inside her. "But your mother recognized me at the hospital. She basically admitted to the connection. She acted like it was nothing more than a footnote in some big business plan." Josh set a hand against his forehead, stepping away. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, voice shaky. "I know it won't fix anything, but please believe me, I had no direct involvement." His gaze met hers, pleading. "I would never have offered you a job if I knew your family had been hurt by Alarcon Holdings. This is a terrible coincidence and it makes me sick to think about it." Sophie's heart hammered. She wasn't sure what she'd hoped for. Some neat apology that erased the past? She tightened her arms around herself. "Julian is furious. He wants me to quit. Says we can't accept money from the same people who destroyed our parents." Josh ran a hand through his hair, clearly distressed. "I understand. But we're not the same as we were back then. My father's gone. I've been trying to reform the company, make it more ethical to avoid exactly these sorts of tragedies. If I had known..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Sophie, I can't undo the past, but I can help you now. Let me try to make this right." She trembled, tears threatening. "How?" "Nothing can bring back the restaurant. My parents died never recovering from that loss." His eyes shone with regret. "I don't know. I don't have a perfect answer. All I can say is that I truly care for you and your brother's well-being. I want to help. I can speak to my mother if you need answers. Or we can try to find ways to honor your parents' legacy. If money is an issue, or if you want to re-establish the restaurant name somehow, I'll do anything in my power." Sophie stared at him, overwhelmed. He stepped closer, gently touching her arm. The closeness made her ache, both from the intensity of her emotions and from the pang of longing in her chest. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe that the kind person she knew was genuine. But 7 years of pain couldn't vanish in one conversation. "I don't know," she whispered, voice thick. "I need time to think about it. And I need you to understand that That this changes things between us." He nodded, eyes clouded. "Take all the time you need. I promise. I'll respect whatever you decide." She exhaled, pulling away from his light touch. Outside that window, the city sprawled in every direction, a testament to the giant footprints of corporations and the small dreams of families. For a moment, she glanced down at her badge that read Assistant Supervisor, a symbol of the second chance Josh had given her. Was it built on the ashes of her parents' dream? Her throat tightened. She needed to get out of there to clear her head. I'll let you know soon." "Sophie," he said softly, heartbreak lacing his tone. But she turned toward the door, hugging the folder to her chest, and walked out without looking back. Sophie left Josh's office feeling as though the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. The documents in her bag felt heavier than ever, a tangible reminder that everything she'd built these last weeks was tied to the same corporation that devastated her parents' lives. Outside, a sharp wind stirred the city air. She glanced up at the tall office building, its glass reflecting the gray morning sky. The reflection of passing cars and pedestrians looked fractured, reminding her of her own sense of turmoil. She forced herself to breathe deeply. Part of her wanted to run back inside, demand that Josh do more, shout at him for his family's cruel expansion that left so many in ruin. Yet a quieter voice warned her that his own surprise had seemed too genuine to be a lie. If he was telling the truth, then the blame rested primarily with his late father and mother. But anger wasn't so easily tamed. She thought of her parents, of her mother's tear-streaked face the day they boarded up the restaurant. That memory fanned the embers of her resentment. Back at her apartment, she found Julian at the small kitchen table, leafing half-heartedly through one of the old cookbooks. He looked up quickly when she entered. "So?" he asked, tension etched in every line of his posture. Sophie set her bag down, eyes brimming with complicated emotions. "He swears he didn't know," she managed, voice shaky. "He apologized, said it was his father's doing, or at least the company's real estate branch before he took charge." Julian exhaled, rubbing his temples. "And you believe him?" She hovered by the couch, not quite sitting. "I'm not sure." He seemed sincere. "I brought the documents, told him everything we found. He said he'd been away in grad school at the time. By the time he joined the company, the deal was ancient history." Julian scowled. "Doesn't change the fact that his family is responsible. Even if he personally wasn't involved, they never tried to right that wrong. They never compensated us, or any of the businesses they crushed." Pain flared in Sophie's chest. "I know, but he offered to help now. He said he'd do anything, talk to his mother, or even support re-establishing our restaurant name if that's what we want. It's too much to process." Her brother fell silent, jaw clenched. Finally, he muttered, "I can't just forgive them, Sophie. I can't. That restaurant was our parents' entire life." "I'm not asking you to," she whispered. "I'm just saying, maybe we should figure out our next step. If we storm out, we lose everything. Your specialist appointments, the insurance." His expression tightened. "I don't want your soul sold to them because of me. I'd rather risk my health than see you in debt to those people." She felt a stab of anguish. "I have a right to decide my own path. If Josh is telling the truth, if he's genuinely different from his parents, maybe working under him isn't the same as working for the father who tore down our dreams." Julian shook his head, rising abruptly. "You don't understand, Sophie. The stress of losing the restaurant practically killed Dad. Mom never recovered. I wake up some nights, still hearing her cries. How can we stand hand in hand with the Alarcons now?" He lurched away from the table, stepping into his bedroom with a forceful push of the door. She stood, shaken, listening as his muffled sobs betrayed the torment inside him. For a moment she considered following, but a part of her knew Julian needed space to release those pent-up emotions alone. Slowly, she sank into a chair, resting her head in her hands. Torn between her loyalty to family and the slim hope that Josh truly wanted to make amends, she felt the edges of her world fraying. That evening, she tried calling Thomas at the restaurant site, hoping to distract herself with mundane updates. He picked up on the second ring. "Everything's all right, but we're behind schedule on the painting. Looks like we'll have to push the opening back by a day or two," he said. Sophie forced a chuckle. "Already? Well, that might save my sanity. I assume you'll be in tomorrow?" She hesitated. "Actually, can I come in later, around midday?" Thomas seemed surprised but didn't press. "Sure, just let me know if anything changes." Her reason for the request was simple. She wasn't ready to face Josh again. Not so soon. She needed a moment to breathe, to figure out what she truly wanted. That night, she curled up on the couch, letting Julian keep the bed, as he often insisted. She stared at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, her heart a tangle of memories and uncertain hope. Morning broke with a light rain tapping at the windows. Sophie woke earlier than she'd planned. Julian was still asleep, his breathing steady. She dressed quietly, grabbed her umbrella, and slipped outside. The drizzle misted her face, reminding her of the day she'd first bumped into Josh at the airport. A bizarre twist of fate. Instead of heading to the restaurant, she found herself walking toward a small park near the old neighborhood where her parents' restaurant once stood. It was a modest square of greenery amid the concrete sprawl, a place she and Julian used to play as kids. Even though the restaurant building had changed hands multiple times since the closure, she still felt drawn to see it, like a pilgrim revisiting sacred ground. Her heart pounded when she finally reached the street. The sign above the old location was new, some trendy boutique selling imported goods. The facade had been renovated, bearing no trace of the inviting entrance her parents had built with such love. No matter how she squinted, she couldn't see even a shadow of the place that once bustled with the laughter of customers, the aroma of spices, the warmth of a family's labor. She stood there for a long moment in the drizzle, trying not to cry. She pictured her mother wiping flour-covered hands on an apron, her father emerging from the kitchen with a smile, offering guests a freshly baked pastry. How proud they'd been, how determined to build a legacy for their children. Eventually, she turned away, heading for the bus stop, tears mixed with raindrops on her cheeks. That dream was gone. Yet life kept pulling her forward, into another chapter, another conflict. She boarded the bus, feeling numb, not entirely sure where her ride would end. But as the bus chugged along, she felt a spark of resolve burn in her chest. If there was even a slim chance Josh's remorse was real, if he wanted to repair some of the damage, maybe she could harness that for good. Not to forgive blindly, but to carve a future that honored her parents, rather than living in perpetual bitterness. It was nearly noon when Sophie arrived at the restaurant construction site. The rain had eased, leaving the pavement slick and shining beneath a hesitant sun. She found Thomas rummaging through color swatches, directing a small crew. Staffers in uniforms milled about, testing the new registers and bar equipment. Thomas caught sight of her. "Hey, glad you made it. Everything all right?" She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just needed some extra time today." "That's fine," he assured. "We'll do a test run in the bar area soon. Could use your input on the front-of-house flow." She dove into the tasks, letting her mind focus on the nitty-gritty details of table arrangements, the angle of the hostess stand, the spacing between seats. For a few hours, she managed to keep thoughts of Josh's confession at bay. Yet, as the late afternoon rolled in, a familiar hush spread through the half-finished dining room. Everyone could sense his arrival before they actually saw him. He walked in quietly, scanning the progress, wearing a sharp suit but with a subdued air about him. She thought he looked more tired than usual. Their eyes met from across the space. She quickly returned her attention to the hostess podium, but felt him approach. "Hello?" he said softly. She glanced up. "Hi." They stood there, an awkward tension crackling between them. In the background, workers hammered away, the hum of electrical tools filling the silence neither dared to break. Finally, Thomas walked over, oblivious to their personal undercurrents. "Josh, good timing. We were about to finalize the bar layout. Want to weigh in?" He tore his gaze from Sophie, schooling his expression into professionalism. "Yes, of course." For the next hour, they collaborated on practical details, the height of the bar stools, the foot traffic patterns. Each time Sophie contributed an idea, Josh acknowledged it with a gentle nod, but neither spoke about the elephant in the room. Thomas seemed to sense something off, but didn't pry. As the day wrapped up, staff began to leave, one by one. Soon, it was just Sophie, Josh, and a lone security guard near the entrance. She finished tidying the hostess stand, running her hands over the polished wood. At last, she couldn't bear the silence anymore. She turned to find him already watching her. "Do you have a moment?" she asked quietly. He nodded, exhaling as though he'd been holding his breath. They walked to a corner of the dining area, where a few round tables were stacked with unopened boxes of tableware. The overhead lights cast a dim glow, revealing dust motes floating in the air. Sophie clasped her hands. "I visited the old site this morning," she began, "where my parents' restaurant used to stand. It's so different now." Josh waited, concern lining his features. She forced out a steady breath. "I can't forgive what your family did, at least not easily. But I believe you when you say you didn't know. And—" she paused, emotion hitching her voice. "I still need this job, Josh. My brother's health depends on the insurance, the income. I can't just walk away." Relief flickered in his eyes, mingled with sadness. "I understand, and I don't blame you for resenting my family. All I can do is promise that I'll do everything in my power to rectify what I can, starting with ensuring you and Julian are cared for." "Rectifying the past is nearly impossible," she said, tears threatening to surface. "But maybe we can find a way forward. My parents always dreamed of reopening. Maybe, I don't know, someday I'd like to honor them." His voice softened. "If that's what you want, I'll stand behind you. We can explore options, like a partnership or a smaller version of your parents' concept. I don't want to push, but the door is open if you ever decide to take that path." She studied him, searching for any sign of manipulation, yet all she found was genuine regret and earnestness. Her heart twisted, still reeling from the betrayal she associated with his family name, but also touched by his willingness to help her shape a new dream. "Thank you," she murmured, wiping at the corner of her eye with the back of her hand. "Just be patient with me. This is all so raw." Josh bowed his head. "I will. I promise." They lingered there, the distance between them a fragile gap that echoed the wedge of history dividing their families. Silence stretched, thick with the weight of unspoken feelings, guilt, sorrow, and something else that felt suspiciously like longing. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I should get going. Julian's at home, waiting. We have another medical appointment scheduled soon. Let me drive you." He hesitated, then added, "Please." She nearly refused out of pride, but exhaustion won out. "All right." Together they walked into the cool evening, neither quite sure where fate would lead them now. But as they stepped outside, side by side, Sophie felt a whisper of change rustling through her heart. The wrongs of the past couldn't be undone, but perhaps new seeds could be planted in the scarred earth, seeds of a future that honored her parents while also allowing for something entirely unexpected, the possibility of trust, or even closeness, with a man whose name once spelled her family's downfall. The days that followed felt like the calm after a storm, but Sophie couldn't shake the lingering tension in the air. She and Josh reached a fragile truce of sorts. She kept her job, and he quietly gave her the breathing room to process the complicated legacy linking their families. Late into the night, she'd lie awake replaying her parents' voices and recalling how, little by little, those hopes of reopening the restaurant had faded. Now, in some strange twist of fate, a new chapter beckoned, where the man whose family destroyed that dream was also the one offering to help revive it. She did her best to focus on work. The restaurant opening was imminent, and she threw herself into training new hires, finalizing menu layouts, and ensuring the decor was finished on time. Thomas noticed how tirelessly she labored, praising her for leading by example every chance he got. Sophie appreciated his support. It was one of the rare bright spots in a life that felt overshadowed by conflicting emotions. Still, a subtle shift had crept into her relationship with Josh. Though they kept their exchanges professional in front of the staff, a current of quiet understanding ran between them. She caught him watching her sometimes, a flicker of remorse and something warmer in his eyes. When they spoke alone, the conversation skated around practical topics, budgets, supply deliveries, staff scheduling, but always seemed heavy with the subtext of their unspoken questions. Could they move past old wounds? Or was this tenuous bond doomed by a history that neither of them had chosen? One evening, after the staff departed, Sophie stood near the hostess station with Thomas, comparing notes about the upcoming soft opening. Beyond them, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a dusky sky, tinged orange by the setting sun. She could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the city winding down from its daily frenzy. "All right," Thomas said, tapping his clipboard. "We've confirmed about 50 guests for the soft opening, mostly friends and family, plus a few industry folks. We're aiming for a relaxed invite-only preview. Think we can handle that?" Sophie nodded. "We'll manage. The servers feel prepared. We have backups in case of mishaps. The biggest variable is the kitchen staff under Chef Ortega. He's still fine-tuning plating styles." Thomas chuckled. "Chefs are always perfectionists, but Ortega's skilled. He'll shine. You'll see." She was about to respond when Josh approached, his footsteps echoing across the polished floor. He looked uncharacteristically casual in rolled-up sleeves, jacket draped over one arm. Thomas greeted him with a relaxed salute. "Evening, boss. We were just recapping the plan for tomorrow's soft opening." Josh glanced between them. "Excellent. I wanted to make sure the front-of-house staff knew I'll be inviting some of my family members. My mother, possibly. Maybe a few close associates." There was the faintest hesitation, as if he were gauging Sophie's reaction. She forced a neutral nod. "Understood. We'll be ready." Thomas checked his watch. "I need to confirm the last deliveries. Let me leave you two to it." He strode off, leaving them alone near the hostess podium. Sophie felt her chest tighten. Carmen Alarcon might be stepping into this space tomorrow. Carmen, who had acknowledged tossing her parents' dream aside with hardly a second thought. Josh read the flicker of worry on her face. "I know it's awkward," he murmured, voice low, "but I can't very well exclude my mother from our first official preview. She's insisted on coming. And you know how she is." Sophie pressed her lips together. "I can handle it, don't worry. I just need to remember she's a guest, like anyone else." His eyes held hers gently. "She won't be just anyone else to you, though, and I get that. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, I'll step in. This is your space, too." A swirl of mixed gratitude and anxiety coiled in Sophie's stomach. She nodded, wanting to show her resolve. "Thank you, really." Josh exhaled softly, giving her a faint smile. Then, with a small tilt of his head, he added, "By the way, how's Julian holding up? Any changes?" Sophie's features brightened a bit at the mention of her brother. "He's improving, I think. The last specialist appointment suggested a better regimen for his medication. There's talk of a surgical procedure down the line, but for now he's stable. I can't thank you enough for the insurance coverage. It's literally saving his life." The shadow in Josh's expression deepened. an unspoken apology for all the damage wrought before he ever offered her a job. "I'm glad. That's the least I can do." Silence stretched, laden with the words they weren't saying. Then one of the waiters came in, calling Sophie's name for help with a bar inventory check. She excused herself, feeling the moment slip away. Still, a subtle warmth lingered in her chest, an undeniable sense that, in spite of the bitterness swirling around them, they were forging a connection stronger than resentment. That night, Sophie returned to find Julian awake, cooking a simple soup in their modest kitchen. The aroma of onions and tomatoes wafted through the air. She blinked in surprise. He rarely felt well enough to stand at the stove for long. "Hey," he greeted softly, ladle in hand. "I thought we could have a warm dinner together. It's been a while since we did that." Her heart pinched at the sight, memories flooding back of a time when they'd both been kids helping their parents in a bustling kitchen. "You didn't have to push yourself," she murmured. "I'm okay," Julian insisted, offering a small smile. "Besides, I needed to take my mind off everything." They sat down to eat in relative silence at their rickety table. The soup was simple but comforting, proof that Julian still had that spark of culinary passion. Sophie sipped from her bowl, letting the warmth flood her chest. Eventually he looked up, meeting her gaze. "So, tomorrow is your soft opening, right? A big step." She nodded. "Yes, it's invite only. We're testing the menu and service flow. I'll be on my feet all night, making sure staff handle any hiccups." Julian swirled his spoon. "Are you going to see Josh's mother?" "Likely." She set her spoon down, steeling herself. "I can't avoid her if she shows up." His jaw tensed. "I'd come along for moral support, but I know it's a work event and I'm definitely not on the guest list." A pained laugh escaped him. "Plus, I don't think I could hide my anger." Sophie reached out, resting a hand over his. "We'll face them in our own time, on our own terms. For now, let me just figure out how to get through tomorrow. If anything goes wrong with the opening, it could jeopardize my position." He squeezed her hand gently, understanding. "I trust you, Sophie. And I'm sorry for being harsh about it all. I just can't help the bitterness. It's still so raw." Her throat constricted. "I know." They finished dinner quietly, each lost in thought. As she cleared the dishes, she couldn't shake a faint tremor of anticipation and dread about the evening ahead. Part of her wanted to see Carmen again, if only to stand firm and show that the daughter of those small, replaceable restaurateurs wasn't powerless. And a smaller part of her was curious about Josh's mother. What might she say or do, confronted with the living memory of the people her deals had crushed? The next day arrived in a blur of activity. By late afternoon, the restaurant brimmed with a subtle hum of excitement. Waiters ironed their vests, the bartenders polished glassware, and Chef Ortega oversaw the final touches in the kitchen. Sophie moved among them like a steady pillar, answering last-minute questions, checking the table settings, making sure the floral arrangements at each corner were fresh and balanced. She wore the official uniform, a neatly pressed black blouse with the restaurant's name embroidered in gold near the collar. Thomas appeared at her side, glancing at his clipboard. "We open the doors in an hour for our first guests. How's everything on your end?" Sophie exhaled. "Seems good. Staff is a bit nervous, but that's natural." He patted her shoulder in encouragement. "We've got this." The lighting was adjusted to a warm glow, the music set at a gentle volume. Outside, dusk settled, the sky painted with oranges and purples. The hostess, a young woman named Carolina, took her place at the entrance, ready to greet guests as they arrived. The first wave of people appeared right on time, checking coats and scanning the elegant interior with interest. Sophie mustered her friendliest smile, gliding through the space to ensure each newcomer felt welcomed. Then, in the middle of a conversation about wine pairings with an early guest, she sensed a change in the atmosphere. She turned toward the door. Josh had just entered, flanked by a presence that made Sophie's pulse hammer. Carmen Alarcón. The older woman looked poised in a stylish pale blue suit, hair swept into an immaculate chignon. Her gaze flicked around the restaurant with mild curiosity. Another figure hovered behind them, Valeria, the same sleek-haired woman Sophie had briefly met at the hospital corridor. Valeria wore a fitted dress, exuding confidence with every step. Sophie straightened her posture, chin lifting a fraction. She quickly excused herself and approached the trio. Josh's eyes found hers, a hint of question in them. He was checking if she was all right. She offered a polite smile. "Welcome to our soft opening," Sophie said, voice steady. "May I show you to a table?" Carmen's expression gave nothing away. Her gaze skimmed Sophie's embroidered blouse, then drifted upward to meet her eyes. "Yes, thank you. Sophie." She stressed the name just slightly. Valeria remained silent but let her lips curl in a faint, dismissive smirk. Josh tried to fill the moment. "Mother Valeria, this is the assistant supervisor I told you about. Sophie has been instrumental in preparing tonight." Carmen dipped her head. "I see. Well, it certainly looks promising." She moved past Sophie with a graceful pivot, heading toward the tables at the far side of the dining room. Before following, Josh paused, leaning close enough for only Sophie to hear. "Are you okay?" She swallowed the knot in her throat. "I'm fine." He nodded, relief mixing with concern, then continued after his mother. Sophie gestured for Carolina to seat them at a special reserved table near the windows. Heart pounding, she stepped away to check on other guests. Yet she remained acutely aware of Carmen and Valeria settling in. She didn't miss how Carmen surveyed the decor, or how Valeria occasionally leaned in to speak, casting glances at Josh that seemed more than casual. Trying to ignore the roil in her stomach, Sophie resumed her hosting duties, instructing servers and ensuring drinks circulated. The music was soft, the chatter lively. A hiss of steam from the kitchen signaled Chef Ortega had begun plating the first courses. A short while later, she risked a glance at Carmen's table. Josh spoke with them quietly, posture stiff, the lines of his face taut. Carmen's gaze flicked to him with an imperious tilt of her head, and Valeria tapped slender fingernails on the tabletop as though impatient. Sophie couldn't hear their words, but the tension was palpable. An unsettled pang twisted in her gut. Maybe Carmen was displeased about the restaurant concept or upset to see how central Sophie's role was. Either way, it put an edge on the evening's otherwise celebratory air. Determined not to crumble under scrutiny, Sophie approached the bar and signaled the bartender Daniel to deliver a special amuse-bouche Chef Ortega had prepared for VIPs. She walked with the tray to Carmen's table, placing bite-sized delicacies gently before them. "Compliments of the chef," she said, her voice unwavering. "We hope you enjoy." Valeria barely looked at the plate, eyes pinned instead on Sophie with a cool curiosity. Carmen, after a second's pause, sampled the amuse-bouche and gave a nod of approval. "It's quite good," she allowed, though her tone suggested it wasn't enough to impress her fully. Josh tried to smile in encouragement. Sophie felt the tension crackle again, but forced herself to remain calm. Then Carmen's next words cut through the polite facade like a knife. "I see you're quite adept at hosting, Sophie, but I remember your parents had certain limitations when it came to running a viable enterprise. Let's hope you've learned from their mistakes." Her heart nearly stopped. A hush fell over their immediate vicinity, though background chatter and music persisted. Josh's features blanched with alarm. Valeria sipped her drink, feigning nonchalance. For a moment Sophie couldn't speak, stung by the cruelty of that jab. Slowly, she found her voice. "My parents were passionate, hard-working people. They treated their customers like family. That's never a mistake." Carmen arched an eyebrow, about to retort, but Josh intervened quickly. "Mother, this is not the time or place," he said quietly, anger threading through his measured tone. We can talk about business deals another day. Tonight is about celebrating the opening. Carmen lifted her wine glass, swirling the contents. Yes, of course, she acquiesced, though a steely undercurrent remained in her eyes. Sophie pressed her lips together, refusing to let tears rise. Instead, she offered a clipped nod and backed away, heart pounding. Her hands trembled with outrage and hurt. That single remark from Carmen reopened every raw wound about her parents' downfall. Still, she forced herself to stay professional, greeting another table with a smile that felt too strained. From across the room, Josh watched her, regret etched across his face. Valeria leaned toward him, whispering something that made him frown. It was as though Sophie stood at the center of multiple swirling currents. Carmen's thinly veiled hostility, Valeria's mysterious presence, and her own determination not to let the past define her future. She wondered if she'd manage to navigate these treacherous waters without drowning in the tide of old resentments. But she couldn't falter. Not tonight. Not when the entire staff depended on her composure. Exhaling, Sophie moved forward, determined to shield her parents' memory from Carmen's barbs. The memory of all they'd lost fueled her resolve. She would succeed here, on her own terms, and neither Carmen Alarcon's disdain nor the swirling uncertainties of fate would stop her. The soft opening continued at a lively pace, with the staff circulating trays of canapes, champagne glasses clinking, and guests mingling across the elegant dining room. Despite the occasional slip, a missing garnish here, a slight delay in the kitchen there, Sophie felt proud of how the team handled every challenge. Her mind, however, remained in a state of constant alert, especially whenever her gaze strayed toward Carmen Alarcon's table. At one point, Chef Ortega emerged from the kitchen to gauge reactions to his creations. Seeing Sophie anxiously scanning the crowd, he sidled over. "How's the atmosphere?" he asked, adjusting his white jacket. She forced a reassuring smile, wiping invisible dust off the hostess podium. "Mostly positive. A few minor hiccups, but overall people seem impressed." He nodded in approval. "Good. Let's keep this momentum." But even as she nodded back, Sophie's stomach twisted at the thought of Carmen's scathing remark. She busied herself checking in on other guests, industry consultants, local foodies, and a handful of supportive acquaintances. Each table she visited left her with the same sense of urgency, to make sure no one had a single complaint worth noting. This soft opening wasn't just about a new business, it was also a test of her own resilience. After another round of ensuring that drinks were refreshed and the staff had everything they needed, Sophie found herself near the curved bar. Josh was there, speaking quietly to Valeria. Their body language made Sophie's chest tighten involuntarily. Valeria leaned in, a hand drifting to touch Josh's wrist in an overly familiar way. He looked uncomfortable but polite, nodding at whatever she was saying. Sophie bit her lip, feeling an odd flutter of jealousy, something she had no right to. After all, her relationship with Josh was tangled and undefined, overshadowed by history. Still, the sight of Valeria's possessive gestures made her chest ache. She swallowed and was about to slip away when Valeria's voice rose. "I'm only saying," Valeria purred, "that your mother and I both worry you're wasting time. You have bigger opportunities than this sentimental project." Josh's jaw set. "This restaurant is hardly a waste, Valeria. It's part of the new direction I'm guiding the company toward." Valeria's lips curved into a half-smile. "But focusing on these smaller ventures distracts from the more lucrative deals. You know Carmen agrees with me." Josh exhaled heavily, scanning the room. His gaze landed on Sophie momentarily. He frowned, as if realizing she might have overheard. "Let's discuss it later, Valeria." Sophie pretended to be absorbed in rearranging some bar menus, but her pulse raced. So Valeria wasn't just a friend or old flame. She was seemingly aligned with Carmen in business matters, encouraging Josh to stick to large-scale deals, possibly the same ruthless expansion that had once shattered her family's dream. Before Sophie could decide whether to approach them or vanish, Josh took a subtle step away from Valeria and made his way over to the hostess stand. Valeria eyed them both for a moment, then moved to join Carmen at their table. He halted in front of Sophie, trying to read her expression. "Sorry you had to hear that," he murmured. "Valeria's views echo my mother's. Hard profit above all else." She offered a strained nod. "I see." Searching his eyes, she added, "If that's what your mother believes, that could mean more families end up like mine did." Josh grimaced. "I don't plan on allowing that to happen. That's why I'm focusing on these smaller, community-based projects, like this restaurant. I told you I'm trying to change the company from within." His quiet conviction eased some of her tension, but the night's reminders of Carmen's disdain still stung. "I hope you can," she said softly, "for everyone's sake." A new group of guests arrived then, diverting Sophie's attention. She saw Thomas escort them inside, motioning for her to help. With an apologetic look, she returned to her duties. Josh watched her depart, a tangle of regret and determination darkening his features. The evening wore on. Sophie's feet ached from traversing the dining room, her cheeks hurt from smiling, yet she remained vigilant. At least the guests seemed genuinely pleased. Most praised the dishes, commented on the tasteful decor, and marveled at how efficiently problems were handled. The staff's confidence grew with each passing hour. Approaching Carmen's table once more, Sophie braced herself. Josh had moved on to speak with other visitors, leaving Carmen and Valeria together. The older woman raised a single eyebrow when Sophie arrived with a fresh bottle of water. "Oh," Carmen said coolly, "you again. I suppose you're ensuring we're well cared for?" "How thorough," Valeria smirked, swirling her wine glass. "Yes, it's impressive. The staff is so eager to please." Sophie suppressed the urge to bristle. She poured water into Carmen's glass with steady hands. "Is there anything else you need tonight, Mrs. Alarcon?" Carmen took a slow sip, her gaze fixed on Sophie as if dissecting her. "You're quite composed," she remarked. "I wonder if you've shared with Josh that you discovered his father's involvement in your parents' misfortune, or are you trying to leverage sympathy to climb the corporate ladder?" Sophie's eyes flared. She set the water pitcher on the table a bit harder than intended. A hush fell between them as Valeria leaned back, intrigued by the tension. Carmen's expression remained unruffled, poised like a queen surveying her subject. "I'm here because I earned this position," Sophie answered, voice level despite the anger simmering beneath. "Not because I want pity. And your son knows exactly what happened to my parents." Carmen's lips thinned. "So you've confronted him? Then you should realize that business decisions aren't personal. I won't apologize for protecting our company's interests." Sophie felt a bitter taste in her mouth. "But you destroyed lives in the process. My parents' restaurant was more than a business decision. It was their legacy." Valeria gave a soft, mocking laugh. "You can't blame all your problems on Carmen. If your parents couldn't adapt, that's hardly her fault." A flash of hurt crossed Sophie's face, morphing into resolve. "You can interpret it however you want, but the facts remain. They were forced out." She glanced at Carmen. "At least Josh wants to prevent this from happening again. Maybe you should listen to him." Carmen's gaze grew frosty. "I'd watch my tone if I were you. I don't care how capable you think you are. My family's patience has limits." Before Sophie could reply, a sudden voice interrupted. "Mother, Valeria." Josh had appeared behind Sophie, his presence casting a chill over the small circle. He stepped forward, offering Sophie a glance filled with concern. Then he turned to Carmen. "I think we've had enough for tonight, don't you? You can see our event is going well." Carmen brushed an invisible speck off her sleeve, ignoring his pointed tone. "We were just having a cordial conversation with your staff." "It's time we leave," Josh insisted. His eyes flicked to Valeria, clearly indicating she should comply as well. The two women rose, collecting their purses. Carmen offered a final, dispassionate nod toward Sophie. "Best of luck in your endeavor," she said, the words dripping with insincerity. Valeria followed suit, casting Sophie a sidelong smirk. Within moments, they were gliding through the exit. Josh stood there, tension radiating from him. The door closed behind them, leaving an uncomfortable stillness in the air. Sophie exhaled, her heart pounding. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice weighed down by frustration. "They had no right to talk to you that way." "It's fine," she lied, though her hands shook. "I appreciate you stepping in." He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the restaurant. A few curious onlookers quickly looked away, returning to their conversations. "I should probably walk them out," he said with reluctance. "But, are you okay?" Sophie swallowed. "I'll manage. Go." He touched her shoulder briefly, just a feather-light reassurance, before hurrying after Carmen and Valeria. As he disappeared, Sophie let out a slow breath, releasing the anger and hurt that still sizzled in her veins. She was grateful he'd defended her, even if it felt too little, too late in the face of Carmen's cold hostility. Brushing off the encounter, she plastered on her professional smile once more and drifted back into the throng of guests. There were still drinks to be topped off, compliments to be gracefully acknowledged, and a host of other tasks to ensure the soft opening ended on a high note. If nothing else, she'd prove to Carmen that she was every bit as strong and competent as her parents had been, and that this time, the Alarcon family couldn't simply sweep her aside. An hour later, the event wound down. Thomas and Sophie stayed behind to oversee cleanup, praising the exhausted but triumphant staff. The consensus was clear. The soft opening had gone better than they'd dared hope. Outside of a few minor snags, guests left with smiles and offers to spread the word about this promising new place. Once the last of the staff said their goodbyes, Thomas jotted some notes on his clipboard, nodding contentedly. "That's a wrap," he announced. "Well done, everyone." Sophie sighed, letting the tension melt from her shoulders. She was about to collect her things when Josh reappeared. His tie was slightly askew, a rare sign of stress, and he offered Thomas a tired smile. "Congratulations, Thomas," he said. "You and your team pulled off a great start." Thomas beamed. "We'll refine a few details, but I think we're on solid ground." He glanced at Sophie, then back at Josh. "I'll leave you two to finish up. I need to lock up the kitchen and check in with Chef Ortega." Without waiting for a reply, Thomas disappeared, leaving them alone in the soft glow of overhead lights. The once bustling room had turned peaceful, but the undercurrent of unresolved tension remained. Josh slipped his hands into his pockets, gaze earnest. "I'm so proud of what you did tonight," he said gently, "despite everything." She mustered a small smile. "Thank you. The staff did most of the work. I just kept everyone organized." He hesitated, eyes drifting to the spot where Carmen had sat earlier. "Mother was out of line. I tried to keep her from causing trouble. If it's any consolation, I confronted her about it on the way out. She stormed off, furious with me." Sophie's lips pressed together. "I appreciate you defending me, but the damage was done long ago. She sees me as inferior, just like she saw my parents. I doubt one argument will change her mind." His face fell. "I know, but I refuse to let her treat you or anyone else like that. This restaurant is my statement that we can do better, that I can do better than my father's legacy." A wave of conflicting emotions surged through her. She reached into her memories, recalling her parents, smiling, dreaming, before it was all ripped away. Then she looked at Josh, who seemed haunted by his family's history, yet determined to forge a kinder path. Her voice caught as she said, "Sometimes I wonder if my parents could have saved their business had they gotten a chance to meet someone like you, someone who cared about people, not just profits." He stepped forward, gently taking her hand. "I know it's not enough, Sophie, but please let me help rebuild what was lost. Even if it's just making sure you and Julian have a secure future, or maybe someday helping you realize your parents' dream in a new way." Her eyes stung with tears. A part of her resisted, recalling Julian's fury. Could they really accept the Alarcon's help after the tragedy they'd caused? But in the depths of her heart, she yearned to see a restaurant sign bearing her family's name, a tribute to the passion her parents had nurtured. Slowly, she tightened her fingers around his, voice trembling. "I want to trust you, Josh. It's just, it hurts so much. There's so much resentment." He leaned in, gaze intent. "I'm willing to wait for you to heal, or to walk with you through it, whichever you prefer. I'm not leaving, unless you tell me to." For a moment, the restaurant's hushed atmosphere enveloped them. Outside, night deepened, city lights glimmering through the windows. She felt her pulse hammer, aware of the closeness between them, a closeness that had grown despite the impossible barriers. She took a shaky breath. "Then stay," she whispered. "Help me make sense of it all. Help me find a way to honor my parents without living in hatred." Josh's eyes shone with relief, and he squeezed her hand softly. "I promise." Though they stood in the shadow of a painful past, right then, a tentative hope blossomed in her chest. This was far from a fairy tale ending. Her parents were still gone, and Carmen's hostility loomed. But perhaps two people could bridge the gap between old grievances and new beginnings, forging a path toward redemption, solidarity, and, dare she believe it, something resembling love. "Come on," Josh murmured gently, releasing her hand but nodding toward the exit. "Let's close up here and go home. Tomorrow is a new day." Sophie managed a watery smile, fatigue and emotions swirling within. Tomorrow indeed would bring fresh challenges, but for once she could face them without feeling quite so alone. A gentle morning sun filtered through the large windows of the restaurant, casting warm rectangles of light across the polished floor. Sophie walked in earlier than usual, ready to oversee another day of post-soft opening revisions. The atmosphere inside felt soothingly hushed, the typical clamor of final preparations replaced by a sense of quiet accomplishment. Yet she couldn't ignore the swirl of excitement mingling with a trace of anxiety in her chest. The grand opening was just days away. She'd spent part of the night lying awake, replaying the conversation she'd had with Josh after Carmen's cutting remarks. In the weeks since learning how the Alarcon family had decimated her parents' restaurant, her mind had been a battlefield of anger and cautious hope. But when Josh vowed to stand by her, she felt something break open within, a release of bitterness, replaced by the tentative possibility that together they might rewrite a painful legacy. Now, as she set her notes at the hostess stand, Chef Ortega approached from the kitchen. "Morning, Sophie," he said, a weary grin creasing his face. "We're testing new dessert plating today. Any chance you can spare a few minutes to sample?" She nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Of course. Lead the way." The kitchen bustled with sous chefs arranging trays of fresh ingredients. A few servers milled about, taking mental notes on today's menu updates. In a corner, the pastry station was set up with fruit compotes, chocolate ganache, and sugared garnishes. Chef Ortega unveiled a plate of delicate cream puffs arranged with floral artistry. Sophie tasted one, eyes widening at the burst of flavor. "That's amazing," she said earnestly. "The cream is lighter than before, and the citrus notes pop." Ortega smiled, relieved. "I took your advice. Used a zest infusion. I'll finalize it if you approve." She gave him a warm thumbs up. "Absolutely. Let's put it on the dessert list for opening night." They exchanged more details about plating and table delivery. As they wrapped up, Thomas poked his head in, clipboard under one arm. "Hey, chef, we need you to confirm the timing for the amuse-bouches. Sophie, got a second for me?" She followed him out onto the main floor, where the new hires were practicing carrying trays. "We're hammering out the schedule for the grand opening," Thomas said, tapping the clipboard. "It'll be a bigger crowd, plus media coverage. A local food critics hinted they might swing by unannounced. Just be prepared." Sophie's stomach fluttered in a mix of nerves and excitement. "Understood. Let's ensure the staff is ready for anything." Thomas nodded. "Which reminds me, you've been such a calm presence. I'm convinced we can handle whatever chaos arises." He cleared his throat. "Josh texted me that he'll be stopping in soon. Says there's some news." Her pulse did a quick jump. "News?" she echoed, uncertain whether that was good or bad. Thomas shrugged. He didn't elaborate, but I'm guessing it's about the event sponsors or possibly the finalized budget. "You know how corporate can be?" Sophie hummed, forcing herself to remain composed. That subtle tension she felt whenever Josh was due to arrive still lingered, but now it was laced with cautious optimism. They'd formed a fragile alliance after all, one built on mutual respect and the hope of healing old wounds. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. She stepped aside, checking the screen. "Are you free this afternoon? I'd like to show you something." N. She frowned in curiosity, texting back, "Everything okay? We have final prep here." S. His reply came swiftly. "It won't take long. Promise. Meet me at the side entrance around 2 p.m. With her heart pounding, she tucked her phone away. He'd never summoned her outside of the restaurant schedule before. What could be so urgent? The morning and midday flew by in a whirl of last-minute tasks. The hostess podium needed a backup seating chart, the bartender practiced specialty cocktails, the chef tested plating for the amuse-bouches, and the servers rehearsed setting the perfect table. Sophie navigated it all calmly, offering guidance where needed, feeling a sense of pride in how prepared they seemed. But as the clock neared 2, a flutter of anticipation rippled through her. She informed Thomas that she'd step away briefly. He rolled his eyes with a teasing grin, muttering something about secret errands, but giving his blessing. Then she exited through the side door, stepping into a mild afternoon sunlight. Josh was there, leaning against his car, a sleek sedan she recognized from past evenings. He straightened upon seeing her, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Thanks for coming." She cast a wary but intrigued look. "I have about an hour. What's this about?" "You'll see," he said with a half-smile. "Hop in. I promise to have you back soon." She hesitated only a moment before climbing into the passenger seat. The warmth of the interior wrapped around her like a cocoon, the faint hum of the engine as he started it up. They pulled away from the restaurant, merging into city traffic with a practiced ease. "You're not kidnapping me, are you?" she joked, trying to mask her nervousness. He chuckled. "Not unless you want me to. But seriously, there's a place I think you should see. Something that might help both of us feel more at peace." His tone, gentle yet purposeful, made her chest tighten. She watched the buildings pass by, wondering where he could possibly be taking her. 10 minutes later, they turned into a quieter neighborhood, older with more trees and fewer high-rise structures. Eventually, they reached a vacant lot beside a row of small businesses, the grass overgrown and a chain-link fence marking the property. He parked and switched off the engine. "Come on," he said softly. She followed him onto the sidewalk, scanning the scene. The lot was empty except for patches of wild grass and a few piles of debris. A rusted sign lay askew near the fence, unreadable from years of wear. "This," Josh began, voice subdued, "is the site where your parents' restaurant once stood. But not the same building. It was torn down after that boutique closed. Now, it's just empty land." Sophie's breath caught. She recognized the approximate location from memory. But everything looked so changed. The final demise of the building itself must have happened quietly, long after her parents had already lost it. He turned to face her, remorse flickering in his eyes. "I found out through some real estate files that the structure had become derelict. Eventually, the city demolished it. The property was shuttled between owners but ended up back with Alarcon Holdings. We never did anything with it, like it was forgotten. She swallowed a knot in her throat, stepping closer to the fence. So this is ours again? Or, well, yours? He nodded. Technically. But I wanted to show you because I'd like to transfer ownership of it to you, if you want it. Her eyes snapped to his, stunned. Transfer the property? He exhaled, glancing at the vacant lot. I know it won't bring your parents back, but maybe it can be a place to honor them, to build something new that continues their legacy. I'm not saying you have to open a restaurant tomorrow, but I thought giving you rightful ownership might at least close the circle. She stared, heart pounding with a mix of gratitude and sorrow so intense it felt like a physical ache. This place, once a symbol of loss, could become a symbol of rebirth. Why would you do that? His gaze softened. Because I believe you and Julian deserve it. Because my family took away more than just a building. We robbed you of a dream. I can't undo that, but I can give you the chance to shape your own destiny on this land. Her eyes burned with tears. She stepped forward, letting her fingertips graze the cold chain-link fence. For a moment she imagined her parents laughing inside a cozy kitchen, the aroma of baking bread drifting through an open window. The memory mingled with the rawness of the overgrown grass in front of her, the fractured timeline of her life. Turning back to Josh, she noticed the worry etched on his features. I don't know what to say, she whispered, voice trembling. Thank you. This is so huge. But I'm scared too. Scared of failing. Scared of repeating the past. He moved closer, tentatively resting a hand on her shoulder. You won't be alone. I'll help, if you'll let me. If you decide to build something here, anything that honors your family, I'll support you. Financially, emotionally, whatever it takes. He swallowed. And not because I feel guilty, but because I believe in you, in your parents' legacy. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She let them fall freely. Julian. He'll be overwhelmed. But I think he'd want this too. Our parents would be proud. Josh's thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek, the warmth of his gesture so tender it broke her heart all over again. She resisted the urge to lean into him, remembering how complicated their relationship remained. Even so, the gratitude and admiration she felt for his efforts were undeniable. She released a shaky breath. This changes everything, she managed. I can't promise what we'll do yet. Julian's health is still the priority. But knowing this is an option, knowing we have a place we can call ours, means more than you can imagine. I do imagine it, he murmured. It's your dream, not mine. I'm just giving the dream back where it belongs. They stood there for a moment longer, the breeze rustling through the unkempt grass. The city noises faded, leaving only the soft thrum of wind and their own unspoken hopes. Sophie felt an odd mixture of euphoria and sadness. Euphoria that a new path was opening, sadness that her parents weren't here to see it. Finally, she wiped her face. We should get back. The restaurant is probably in chaos without us. He smiled, a spark of quiet relief in his eyes. Yes, let's go. They returned to the car, driving in companionable silence. Sophie stared out the window, mind spinning with possibilities. If Julian approved, they could one day construct a new establishment, a homage to the place her parents had lovingly built. And this time, it wouldn't be threatened by cutthroat expansions. Not if Josh kept his vow to change Alarcon Holdings from within. By the time they reached the restaurant, the sun was higher, illuminating the front entrance with a bright glow. Josh parked, and they stepped out onto the sidewalk. Before Sophie could stride back to work mode, he gently took her hand, concern flickering across his features. Are you okay? He asked, voice low. She nodded, gazing at their entwined fingers. I am. It's a lot to process, but in a hopeful way. Her lips curved into a tentative smile. "Thank you for trusting me with this." He squeezed her hand softly. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make amends. I know it doesn't erase the past, but I hope it creates a better future." Their eyes locked, charged with the understanding that they were standing on the edge of something bigger than either of them. The possibility of healing old wounds and forging a connection that transcended their family's tangled history. In that fragile moment, Sophie believed they might succeed. She inhaled, letting the warmth of the morning sun mix with the flutter in her chest. "We'd better go inside," she finally said. "Thomas will think we abandoned ship." Josh gave a quiet chuckle. "Right." They entered side by side, stepping into the bustling restaurant where staff and preparations awaited. Yet, the real story lay outside these walls, in that vacant lot that was no longer just an emblem of loss. It had become a promise, a blank canvas where Sophie and Julian could shape their own destiny, backed by the unlikely support of the man whose name once symbolized their downfall. Perhaps the seeds of a new dream had already been planted in the soil of that abandoned property. Perhaps, amid the old scars of betrayal, something beautiful was preparing to bloom, showing that even the harshest past could give way to a future built on redemption, kindness, and the daring hope of true forgiveness. So they walked forward together, shoulders almost touching, bound by a shared determination to rewrite the story that once tore them apart. Because sometimes, even the greatest wounds can begin to mend when two hearts dare to find common ground, in honor of what was lost and in celebration of what could still be found. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen